Policy and Services Committee for Wednesday, April 8th, 2015. Would the clerk please call the roll?
Councilmember Berman?
Here.
Chair Byrd?
Here.
Councilmember Wilbach?
Here.
Councilmember Du Bois? 4 present.
Great. So we have one extensive item tonight, which is referrals from both our January 31st, 2015 City Council retreat and our February 17th, 2015 City Council meeting of the whole regarding procedural matters, including updates to the Procedures and Protocols Handbook. And so we were referred a lot of different materials. We also have one item at our places tonight that supplements the staff report. Cash, Jim,
Mr. Chair, we didn't really have a staff presentation. The council knows as much of what we're doing here as we do, but maybe Cash, a little more detail on just orienting folks in the materials. I know some of them are just looking at them now. So.
Yes, good evening. So at your meeting on the 31st, you raised several issues to discuss regarding this item, and then we brought those items to the retreat on the 17th, and there was 3 handouts at the retreat that council members had sent into the clerk's office and we had brought at places. So in essence, attachment A, which states referral items, is a copy and paste of those 3 documents, a little bit organized under the toppings of discussions of procedures and protocols and meeting management. And then if you go to page 3 of that, there were some items that at the retreat the council did already forward to the committee as a whole. So we put those at the end. And then in preparation for this meeting, as Jim and I were talking, there were 3 items left off of the staff report, and those are at your places. The reason I didn't include those in the staff report is because they weren't involved with the protocols and policies manual, which is what we were going to look at tonight. Those other 3 items at your places are the appeals process, the day of the policy services committee, and the revolving door policy. Those are all either municipal code, fee schedule, or other city policy changes. So we couldn't speak about them tonight, but
if I just might add to that, thank you, Cash. You know, in the background on the report, we summarize really what happened at the committee, the whole meeting on the 17th, and as we went back and looked at it, the council referred to policy and services, procedures and protocols, and meeting management. And then the questions of committees and staff relations were deferred to the next committee of the whole meeting, which has not yet been scheduled. And the attachment that Cash referred to, item number 1, has suggestions relating to procedures and protocols and meeting management, which are ostensibly before the committee. It also has these other items that are listed under these items of going to the committee as a whole. I will obviously leave it to the chair and the council members. I still would have to think that this is just a record from your prior meeting. The committee clearly has free rein to talk about other issues in these areas. So with that, we're here to work with the council, do our best to answer questions if at all needed. But this, as much as anything, seems like a real conversation amongst council members at the committee level.
Well, let me start by having us talk a little bit about how we'd like to proceed tonight and grapple with the different kind of segments of this. I think even more than most of our committee meetings, tonight's discussion is going to be a pretty informal one. As I recall, and Beth may be able to clarify this, when we've had cleanups to the procedures and protocols handbook, we've often given the input essentially with consensus and not have to vote on every word, and then the clerk comes back having captured what was done in that meeting for a subsequent formal referral of that to the council. Am I remembering that correctly? Roughly? Oops.
That's correct. We'd bring back the red line version for later approval.
And ideally, we'd be having this kind of discussion in the other room, but it's still under some construction, so we'll just be informal up here on the dais. And then, if I might toss out kind of a few different major sections and then a thought on how we might dive into it. So we have the specific referrals from the retreat and the committee as a whole. And they're broken up between a section on procedures and protocols and one on meeting management. But I'm kind of struggling on how we do anything meaningful on meeting management if it's not part of procedures and protocols. And there are portions of procedures and protocols that address meeting management. So I kind of think of that as a major subsection of procedures and protocols rather than outside of procedures and protocols. But we may discover otherwise. There may be certain things that we put into a bucket that we don't want to actually formalize in a procedure or protocol, but it might be something that we suggest we try out this year or something as a recommendation, so it's even less formal. And then we have the other section of the items going to the committee as a whole, and I think we'll have a question whether we do any discussion of that tonight to try to help the next committee as a whole, or whether we just leave that alone. So that's another question for us. And then we have these other things that were at our places, and they are not necessarily aspects of procedures or protocols. And then given those kind of buckets, I'm wondering whether we might want to start with an opportunity for colleagues to speak about some of the major areas, and then we could go through in a kind of linear manner through the policy and procedures manual, or we could take them up as they're framed under the referral items, but I still want to ultimately have an opportunity to go through the policy and procedures manual on things that are not in those referrals, because I see a lot of things in the policy and procedures manuals that are not clear and not necessarily reflective of current practice, and that we need to dive into them. So that's several different elements to tonight's discussion and a couple different ways we might proceed. So any comments? Tom?
Just so that we're not repeating ourselves and circling back, I guess my inclination would be to just go through the policy and procedures doc kind of page by page and use that as the structure for the discussion. Otherwise, it feels like we may circle around.
We could? Yep. Others? Mark?
I'm happy to start with that. I mean, I don't have a good answer, so I'm happy to start that way. I'm just kind of trying to figure out how we're going to get everything accomplished in a couple of hours tonight. I mean, it sounds like we've got a boatload to discuss. So, we might as well just dive in, but I'm not planning on I'd encourage that we not go till 11 o'clock tonight, dealing with policies and procedures.
Okay, well, when we get to it, you are fine to wade in on things that shouldn't be discussed as we go into them, but let me kick off one question that has always bothered me, because when I go back, I can't find any definition of a policy or procedure versus, pardon? No, I was looking for you to. I didn't see it.
So as far as the process tonight goes, I actually would suggest that I would actually suggest that we go through the at places memo, as well as the couple of pages that were typed up at the start of the staff report on, pages 4 to the top of page 6 of the staff report, and go through those items maybe, and then following that, go through the policies and procedures manual, skipping to any items that that we've each identified as areas that need work, rather than going through the entire thing line by line.
So that kind of is along the lines of this notion I had of us talking at a higher level, where we go through the things that have been identified as substantive items, and then as we maybe arrive at consensus on those, and then later go through page by page of both where those would fit in the policy and procedures manual. And I think as we do discuss these, we will need to refer to the appropriate pages. And so that's going to be one of the dilemmas. And maybe Beth is going to be able to be quick enough on her feet to point to each paragraph that's relevant to the discussion under the referral items. I think if that's okay, I think that might have us focus on the most important things first, and then we can go into the others. Okay?
Pat, may I make one comment before we start? Thank you. So a couple of things, actually. I would suggest, in one sense, if the committee could think about an end time, like no later than 10, that's 3 hours. This is our third night meeting this week, and some of us even have a meeting tomorrow night. And it's one thought. Secondly, in any case, I'd be surprised if the committee will get through everything you want to get through in this area. And you just might want to think, if we don't see a real context problem, there might be the potential to, I don't say piecemeal this, but take things back to the council in batches so you don't have to store everything up. And third, I think going to this point of reviewing the work you already had done as we look at the relevant sections. One of the things we might do is either come back to the committee once we've integrated the formal changes into the document after you've looked at them, or you feel comfortable enough in delegating it to the staff if you did want it to go forward to the council as a whole. But probably once you see whatever you've dealt with and we put it in the document, that might be a time when you're re-looking at it, that there could be other issues within the procedures and protocols that would pop up out there from the page. But I do like the idea of, clearly there's stuff the council's already identified as issues and concerns, and if we could start to knock those out, that would be good.
Okay, so let me start with this framing issue about what's a procedure and what's a protocol. I had historically taken these procedures and protocols and construed that the procedures section were more closer to rules and the protocols were more guidelines. And then a year or two ago, I tried to find that within any reference, and it's not there to my knowledge. And then when I brought it up with a couple colleagues at the time, I can't remember, we did it in a public meeting, I think, and they didn't even agree with that interpretation. And so here we've got two different things, and nobody seems to know why we have procedures and why we have protocols. And City Attorney, you have any thoughts on this?
Yes, it's an interesting question that you have asked several times. You know, the document itself describes the whole document as a handbook, and it talks about the goals of the handbook. So these are not terms that really suggest legally binding, detailed requirements. I do agree with Chair Burt that when you read through the two documents that are put together here, you know, each one is somewhat of a grab bag of topics, but the first one does tend to be a little bit more rule-based and specific, and the second one is a lot of issues of tone and expectations of how people, more aspirational about how people will behave. So I think that's an accurate
Yeah,
description.
that's a description of what they are, but there's nothing in
We
there
don't put it
that's
that way.
a
And I'm just
preamble
wondering, I
or
mean, Pat,
definition.
you would be the only one here who might have an inkling probably of this, whether there was anything historical as far as linear about the evolution of these, you know, to the extent that there were more things in whatever we called the policies. And then later on, these tone discussions, you know, a number of years ago, there were issues, and then we set the council, we started to add a bunch. I would just humorously point out that we've maintained the confusion by calling this actually the Protocols and Procedures Handbook, but we do start with the the policies first. So we actually, Protocols and Procedures, maybe I'm doing it wrong. Maybe I'll go back. Yeah, we do invert the order also. So I do think at the end of the day, a little cleanup by us would be good as far as clarity.
Right, I think so.
So what I'll note is that actually the sections are, the first one is called procedures, and the second one is called protocols.
But it has a subsection of the procedural issues.
And if the chair would allow me
just a sec.
also, just to follow up.
And I'll just say that the title of this meeting is Policy and Protocols Handbook. So I think we've been kind of interchanging these terms, and I do think that they were originally intended to have different meanings, and we never defined them well, and because of that, we've somewhat lost sight of the intended differences.
So if I could add, and this is an important framing comment for everyone to be aware of. When the council makes rules for itself about how it's going to conduct its business, that can be very, very useful in terms of organizing your own expectations of yourself and your colleagues and communicating with the public about how you're going to conduct your meetings. But the council remains the supreme authority governing the city of Palo Alto, and it's in charge of its own way of conducting business. And in any given point, the chair takes the lead based on the written procedures, protocols, policies, whatever we choose to call them. But the council retains the ability to modify those by a majority vote. So
On the spot.
yes, in most cases on the spot. The exception to that would be in those cases where maybe third-party rights are involved and you've communicated to the public that they have an expectation in certain areas. But most of these rules are really about how you run your business and how you work with your staff. So you do have the ability to modify those when necessary for unique situations, and future councils will also retain that ability.
Well, I'll add one other place where I don't think we have that discretion, and that is where the procedure actually repeats something that's in the municipal code. And we had this issue about meeting start times, for instance. And so we didn't have that discretion.
That's correct. You don't have that discretion as a matter of resolution or motion. You would have the ability, of course, to pass an ordinance changing the municipal.
Correct. Okay, so does anybody have anything relating on that subject at this time, or we want to kind of keep it in the back of our minds as we go through this? And I would suggest that as we look at changes to procedures and changes to protocols, we maybe do that thinking on, is this something we want to call a council rule, self-imposed rule, or is it a guideline? And that may be how we end up clarifying these different sections for the future. I think that in response to what Jim kind of asked, my historic memory is that at one time that was the case, and that we've lost sight of it, but there may be people in the community with better memories than me on that. Maybe we have one in the audience here. All right, so let's go ahead and kick it off with starting with Attachment A, and the first portion of discussion of procedures and protocols regarding telephone participation. And in this one, we can...
Pages 6 and 7.
6 and 7 of the procedures.
And going into 8, 6, 7, and 8.
Okay. So let's start at a high level rather than dive into the wording. this was referred to us by the council because there was really a question whether we should loosen up this process. And I can give you a little historic perspective on this. My recollection is that it was tightened up a number of years ago because an eminent member of our council had taken a job assignment where he was full-time primarily in DC, and it became the norm to have phone-in meetings, and it became really problematic. So we went kind of from an occasional occurrence where we had phone-ins to it was over the top, and then I guess a year or two later, the council tightened up their rules. And I think the question is, are the rules now too tight? And if so, how might we want to change them? So let me kick it off with that framing. Anybody?
Yeah, good question, actually.
Corey?
Well, actually, first, I'd ask the city attorney weigh in, perhaps framing this in the context of the Brown Act, so we know kind of where are the limits that we can go in this discussion that will be worthwhile, given Brown Act restrictions, if you're able to.
Yes, thank you, Councilmember Wolbach. So if you look at the top of page 7, there's a series of bullets. Those describe legal requirements, and so the council would not have the ability to cut back on those items. So you do need to be able to be in a area that's accessible to the public. You have to post in advance. There can't be admission charged. So if a council member, for example, is in, say, a hotel in a conference room, it does need to be posted in advance. People have to be allowed to come in and be present at that location. And I'm just looking at these rules. I think we will cross-check the current versions, elements of the Brown Act, but I believe that this does cover all of those elements of state law.
Okay. Mark?
So, I mean, while I think it's perfectly fine to miss meetings, especially if you're away, I do think that, you know, one should have a council member should have the ability to participate via phone if, you know, on a limited basis, if they're away and there's, you know, either controversial or you know, issues that they're passionate about that are on the agenda that evening. I'm not very passionate personally about this. And so, you know, it's not something that I feel incredibly strongly about, but I do see why it might be nice to move a little bit away from the very strict rules that we have right now and say maybe council members can call into 3 council meetings a year or something like that as a general, you know, to provide some flexibility for folks who do have to travel for various reasons or unexpected reasons. I recall that when this issue came up earlier, the wording of the policy was such that it almost made it impossible to meet the policy and fulfill the requirements of the Brown Act. And so we'd have to clean up that language that said, well, it has to be something, you know, you can only call in if it's something totally unexpected or something along those lines. But for Brown Act purposes, you have to notice it 72 hours ahead of time. So it can't be totally unexpected. So we'll have to be cognizant of that contradiction.
I think I can point out what you may be referring to.
Yeah.
So in 2.4B, 4th line down, it says telephonic attendance shall only be permitted in the event of extraordinary events such as a medical, family, or similar emergency.
Yeah.
So I think you're probably dwelling on the,
Emergency,
especially the emergency part, and then the Brown Act requirements that follow that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we'll have to kind of, you know,
Can I chime in on that?
mesh those. I'd also be curious if staff knows or if other colleagues know, you know, what's normal, you know, protocol for other cities and whether or not there are, you know, cities around here that have less restrictive procedures on this that we could look to as guidance.
Okay, Corey? Want to follow?
Yeah, and also, sorry if I missed it, but I was just going to emphasize the perhaps contradiction between 2.4B on page 6 of the manual and then on page 7 under approved teleconference guidelines for council members, on page 7. So on page 6, it says basically you can only participate in an emergency. On page 7, it says you can only participate remotely if you give a week's notice. And having a week's notice for an emergency is not usually that easy. So I'd suggest that we strike one of those.
Yeah.
Whichever one, or combine them in some way that, yeah, as Mark says, to clean it up.
Well, I think before we get into wording, let's decide the concept of what we want to do.
Yeah.
Tom?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think I'd echo what Mark said. I think, was it last fall, I guess, when Liz was in Hawaii and the issue came up. So I think something that's less about the conditions, is it emergency, non-emergency, but maybe the frequency, like once a quarter would make sense. It does feel like the pendulum kind of swung too far, and so swing it back, but not make it totally wide open, or it's whenever you feel like it. It's a question for city attorney. The 72 hours prior at the location, is that required as far as you know?
I'll check to confirm, but I believe that it is.
Okay. Yeah, so I would just, whatever we could loosen it up a little bit, if you had, say, once a quarter, and then, a week's notice. That sounds like a lot too, but whatever the minimum requirement is, I guess I'd be in favor of. I guess there's another question which was brought up, I think at the retreat, was, and should there be different rules for closed session versus open session?
So if I could just make a comment, the clerk may want to weigh in. I believe the advance notice, the 1 week, that's not a Brown Act requirement, but the clerk's office does need to provide some support for this activity. They need to make sure that you get the notice in your remote location, that it's properly posted. They need to coordinate the phones and make sure the phone is here. So that notice partially serves to allow staff to support the activity.
Right. And actually, one last point is, do we want to contemplate the use of Skype or some kind of video conference? There's a part in here about the public has to be able to participate in the same way, which I guess implies you have a speakerphone at the location. So just maybe clarifying the technologies out of that, what you have to have.
Yeah, and there's, you want to deal with the technology. On page 7, under approved teleconference guidelines, in that first paragraph, the last sentence precludes the use of cellular telephones. That might have been a little more relevant when this was first written.
Right.
Where is that again, Jim?
It's in the first bullet on page 7 in the middle paragraph, approved teleconference guidelines for council members underlined. The last sentence, cellular telephones, in the first paragraph.
Right. And now they have speaker modes when they probably didn't when
Yes,
this was written.
so it would be lawful to use them, but they do need to have that speaker function, because what the Brown Act requires is that the public can be present here. They can also be present at any location and provide public comment from that location where a council member is.
Okay. Let me just ask this one clarification that is the legal and the logistical on the 72 hours. So 72 hours is the Brown Act for a regular meeting. And Beth, from the clerk's standpoint, that means that we have to have at that location 72 hours, correct? So how much time in advance do you need if a council member was saying, okay, I'm going to be at a location and want to participate, and they have to get it noticed 72 hours in advance, how much more than that do you need to be able to accommodate that?
You already had it. I'd say at least a day or two in advance so that we can get it up on the website. And hopefully the council member is already at the location so that we can get it to them also to be able to post.
So if we have Monday meetings, 72 hours for us counts a weekend, so not work days. So that's basically on a Thursday
Night?
evening.
Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday evening. Is it when the meeting starts?
Correct, when the meeting starts.
Yeah.
So
So-
wouldn't it be Friday evening? Friday to Saturday, Saturday, Sunday, Sunday to Monday?
You're right, Friday evening. So if it was, say, required that it was by the Wednesday beforehand, or 5 calendar days beforehand, that would meet your needs adequately?
Yes, it would, because we would also have to do the revised agenda. Now that the agendas are going out 11 days in advance, we'd have to do a revised agenda, get it to the newspapers and all of that also.
Well, and then also, not that the packet's the driving factor here too, but typically we now have packets going out on Thursdays, right?
Correct.
So if you had it by Wednesday, you'd be able to jigger the,
We could include it
something
in the
in the
packet
packet
going out on
notice.
Thursday.
And Tom raised the issue about closed versus open sessions, and I guess we want to ask ourselves, so what's different about them? And one aspect is that having a remote participant in a closed session is less disruptive. Frankly, we're around a table, and members of the public don't have to be able to hear what's being said. When a council member is participating remotely in an open session, it can be pretty disruptive on the meeting, and that's something to consider when we look at liberalizing this. And that was, frankly, the reason this was tightened up. It just made it very hard to have regular meetings. And I guess one other consideration is whether we want to encourage, if council members participate remotely, and if we were to say that we want to discourage it, but allow it where it's a critical matter to the council member, then we may want to consider whether we want to encourage that they only participate in that critical matter remotely. So that's another consideration.
Comment on that. That's why I was bringing up something like Skype, where you have a talk or video channel and a chat channel. And potentially a council member could signal to the clerk that essentially the same thing as pushing their button that they want to speak. So maybe it could be less less of an interruption than maybe it was in the past with just a speakerphone. They could basically raise their hand electronically. They could be called on as if they were here in the room.
So you didn't mean necessarily the video portion of Skype, you meant just the
It could be either.
meeting.
I mean, but in addition to that, there's the chat channel where you could say, I want to speak or whatever.
Well, and
Yeah.
my concern would be that the video might be even more disruptive, whereas the chat channel might be less disruptive.
Right, so voice plus a chat channel.
And we wouldn't have to have that in protocols to be able
Yeah,
to
no,
accommodate
I
that.
agree.
Right.
I will defer
Court?
to.
Yeah, and just to clarify, I think most of us understand, but just to make sure it's clear in the record, when you're referring to chat, you mean a text chat rather than a verbal chat. Yeah. I think we're all pretty familiar. I just wanted to clarify that. And also, just one other thing about, actually 2 other questions on this topic. One, where it says, items have to be faxed or mailed. In the modern day, could that include emailing, or does it have to be faxed or mailed because of a legal requirement beyond Palo Alto's purview? Looking at page 7, so page 16 of the packet, the second bullet point from the bottom, referring to the city clerk, will assist if necessary by faxing or mailing the agenda to whatever address or fax number, yada, yada. So that's one question.
No, there's no legal requirement about how that gets done. It's just you need to get the agenda to the location and get it posted.
So it could be...
Carrier pigeon would be sufficient.
Very good. Okay, so we'll break those out of the 8th floor. And also, one question is, do we want to, right now, I think, especially if we're talking about, which day we want to have things, I think we're primarily talking about regular council meetings. Do we want to think about how this applies also potentially to committee meetings or other special meetings that are not scheduled on Mondays? So just more food for thought.
Mark? Oh, I'm sorry, Jim, you've been
I'll
waiting.
defer to
Well,
Mark.
I just want to give a global comment, which is if staff could take a look at all of the policies and procedures and update where they see, for technology or these kind,
Right.
Yeah, let's just give that direction to them, and then they can come back to us. And if we identify places that they've missed, rather than having to point out each one.
If I could offer a couple thoughts, just listening to you, Mr. Chairman. So first of all, we have these requirements on page 7 that are limiting, and they're based in the law, and they can't really be modified. And then you have this overlay. So, you know, one piece, I mean, you're potentially heading there, but you haven't gotten to it, is to drop one of these or modify one of them. One alternative was not have a threshold of these situations, because the emergency in the 72 hours, and actually the emergency in 5 days in advance gets a little, you know, it's disconnected. And so maybe there is a limitation on the number of events that somebody could have. That even being said, 3 council members times 9, that's 27. You know, that's 2 meetings every month if they were always on a different day that you could have somebody not there. Secondly, I would say, I do think we need to acknowledge that it can be disruptive. It's not just here. Any teleconference doesn't work quite as well. Sometimes people are sitting there waiting for the person who's talking, you know what I mean, or they interject. And just for fun, I would tell you, we had this a fair amount in Berkeley, and who was a council, the story is good because it was an all-woman council at the time, and one council member was out. And literally, I mean, she was repeatedly kind of breaking in and interrupting, and, you know, you could see everybody getting exasperated, coming out of the ether almost. And finally, one of the council members leaned the mic and says, does anybody else feel like we're on Charlie's Angels here? So it can't minimize that disruption. And then the last thing I want to say is, it's probably good for the committee to think about why, for what role or outcome do you want to allow the participation? And my thoughts are that there could be 3. One would be a council member wants to be able to vote on an issue. The second is a council member wants to be able to speak on an issue and potentially influence by what they say. And the third is a council member just wants to be sure that they spoke, that their comments were available. Now, the fact is, a council member could do that now without a change. If you were not at a meeting, I don't think there's anything that precludes a council member from sending in writing to the council for public information that this is how you feel about an issue. So it might help as how you structure any other limitations, whether it's texting or whatever, what the objective is, because it does manage the disruption, and sometimes the remote person can almost sort of have a disproportionate sort of effect in the meeting. I do think that that's Pat's comment about the video starts to be all of a sudden everybody starts looking at the person on the video if you're doing that. Just ought to be aware of that. The last thing I just would say is, it obviously seems to be more of a problem if you have 1 person out of 9 missing a meeting than if you have 2 or 3, you know, and everybody's remote. So you also ought to think whether there's any way that you meter that in some way.
Well, let me wade into that last one first, and then I think I've jotted down the kind of the policy-related issues, and maybe we can knock them off and see whether we have consensus. So it occurred to me that if we liberalize this very much, and council members just in particular want to be present for votes to influence outcomes. We've had a number of meetings where we've had trouble getting more than 7 council members. And so then do we start getting kind of a flood of council member remote participation because they want to influence an outcome, and through their voting, rather than more than through their voice, I guess is what I put it. And I think that would become problematic quickly. So I think we may want to loosen this up a little bit, but I would caution against doing it too much. And so let me go through what I think I've captured, and if I miss things, wade in. So first, maybe a more easy to handle procedural thing. We have the 1 week that well exceeds the 72-hour requirement. We heard that 5 days, calendar days, would work for the city clerk. Is that a direction we want to go?
Yep.
Okay, we have consensus on that. Good. I'll just assume all the rest of the evening is going to go that easy, and we'll just. Do we want to consider wording that would be more liberal for closed session than open session?
Yeah. Sorry, say that again.
Do we want to look for wording that would be more liberal in it, allowing participation in closed session than open session?
So we didn't really talk about it, but I think there's potentially other issues with closed session, and that you need to ensure the remote person is in a private location now and it's closed.
But that can be a requirement. I mean,
Yeah.
you can simply state that.
So I don't know, I guess I kind of see them as we're fairly equivalent. I'm not sure if we need to distinguish between the two in terms of making one more liberal than the other.
Corey?
Well, since the Brown Act requirements stipulate the 72 hours, and that's about having public access, City Attorney, correct me if I'm wrong, but that would not apply to closed session, is that correct?
Yes and no. So at the remote location, you have to do the same thing that you do here. So you need to convene the meeting in the open, allow in any members of the public, allow that public comment on the closed session to occur, should people wish to make public comment. Then you do need to secure the location, and that is a legal requirement. If you're in a closed session remotely, it does need to be private. So you need to lock that door, or basically, that's what you need to do. You need a door that closes and excuse me?
We would have to vote on going to closed session with that remote person and then go into the closed session and lock the door.
Yes, I mean, I think this can be handled in the same way with the remote.
Yeah, okay, thank you for clarifying that. And actually, I would echo what Councilmember Du Bois was saying, that the enforcement of the security of a remote location is, that's actually something we might want to think about identifying in the language, just because that's a little tricky. Just requiring it and saying it's required, but actually enforcing it and checking it are two separate things. Yeah.
Okay, so this is not an enforcement tool. Okay, it's the responsibility of the participant to do that. Okay. So going back to the question, do we want the same guidelines other than just clarifying the, that it has, what the requirements are if you're participating remotely in a closed session. But as far as what we allow or encourage or discourage, do we want the same guidelines for closed and open, or do we want different ones?
So to me, it'll kind of depend on what we end up resolving on the open. You know, if we, because I don't think it needs to be unlimited for closed. So if it's a couple for open, I think that can probably apply to, personally, I think that can probably apply to closed also. We don't want to be encouraging people to do this on a regular basis.
So if I could make a suggestion on the,
Tom?
on the open, I mean, there's a lot of stuff in here that I think should stay. Like, we're going to discourage people from doing this, so we don't end up with 3 people doing it at every meeting. And it seems like really in 2.4B, just changing that one sentence about emergencies to once every 3 months seems like a minor tweak that we could try rather than changing a bunch of language.
Corey?
If I may, there's another situation that is not exactly an emergency, but if there is some personal or family medical reason why somebody might say a council member is injured and is cogent but is in the hospital getting well for a couple of weeks, that's a situation where I would want to make sure that they had an opportunity to participate remotely for those 2 weeks, even if they are in the same quarter. And so this kind of goes back to a question I'd been meaning to ask earlier, which is, are there ways that we can discourage something here without prohibiting something? And that's kind of, I think, what we're all looking for, is how do we discourage people from exploiting an allowance without outright prohibiting it. And I don't have a good answer on that, so I'm open to ideas.
Well, let me kind of point out some of the more problematic words that in my mind, create those problems. So back in 24B, fourth line, first we have actively discouraged. So we could make that less strong or keep it the way it is. Then we have shall only, and those are prescriptive. They're not discouragements, they are strict boundaries on what can happen. And then we go in, we say extraordinary events, and then we describe those as emergencies. So if emergency wasn't there, but they were extraordinary events, the intent would probably be clear that we're meeting that they're not routine.
I mean, that's why I'm suggesting once a quarter is, if you're on a business trip in Asia, but you want to participate, you would be allowed to do so, even though it may not be extraordinary.
So that brings up the question of whether the infrequent remote participation should be based upon the circumstance or just based upon the frequency. So let's talk about that then. Corey?
Well, actually, perhaps we should say that, something like once a quarter, except in extraordinary events such as medical, family, and I wouldn't say, or similar, I would just say medical, family, or, emergencies requiring the absence. So basically to say, if you're going to be taking a trip, whether it's for business or maybe you're attending a California League of Cities on behalf of the city or doing something else that takes you outside of the city for good reason, as a member of the council or for the mayor or vice mayor attending something elsewhere, whether it's in DC
Understood.
or whatever.
So if it was along the lines of, we said, not more than once a quarter, except in these extraordinary circumstances, would that work? And is that along the lines of what we would want to recommend?
I mean, that next sentence is a good one. It says a quorum must be present physically. So you wouldn't have a meeting with 5 people remote.
Yeah, but we don't need to address that. I mean, I think that's kind of a
You
given.
skipped the first sentence, which actually started to concern me. Which says,
But wait a minute.
Yeah.
I tried to frame kind of a higher level question, which is it our intent rather or would we find appealing a proposal that says not more than once a quarter, except in these extraordinary family or medical emergencies? Is that a concept that we think describes where we'd want to take it? Mark?
I mean, I'd be fine with that. I'd be fine with that. I'm fine with that.
Corey?
Yeah, I think I'd be fine with that. The trick for me is also, even for those once per quarters, how do we actively discourage without prohibiting it? And
We
Very
can
intangibles.
retain the language of
Right.
actively discourage.
I'm trying to imagine how that actually gets implemented. I'm trying to think about how these become actuated in reality, and how do you actively discourage without prohibiting is a tricky question. I'm happy to, and I think we.
Well, let me
definitely should
just
keep
say
the
that
language. It's just a
that
question of
basically
enforcement.
applies to almost all of our policies and procedures. So that goes back to the discussion we had at the outset of what are these and how are they implemented and how are they enforced. And they're largely self-enforced, and with the mayor having a lead responsibility if we have issues around significant breaches of procedures and protocols. I mean, as we go through all these, you'll see, God bless the person who in 8 years doesn't break any of these. Jim?
So a couple of thoughts. So if the issues are having some frequency-based exception or not an exception, opportunity. So under once a quarter, each council member could miss up to 4 meetings. And then you're trying to craft language that could say, under these extraordinary situations, you could go beyond those 4. That's really what we're saying. I'm not advocating this. Another way to deal with it, because you're dealing with both accommodating the council, but I think you're also dealing with council cohesion in a sense. Obviously, I mean, if somebody could game the system, it would start to disrupt the council a little bit. I mean, you could have language that doesn't try to speak to the extraordinary, but deals with, for example, the thing Tom was talking about, which is, you know, any council member facing an extraordinary family situation could, you know, petition the council for an exception to the policy. So the council gets to weigh in on something. The idea is if we're talking about extraordinary family emergencies, it's a little weird that the council member it would be so extraordinary and important that they'd still be saying, I got to be at that meeting rather than at the bedside of the family member. But certainly the being in the hospital or something and laid up, I could see somebody saying, yes, obviously, let's make an exception. The council could vote to say, yes, we authorize this to happen. So you get your 4, but the council has a voice, something to think about.
And let's just do the math a moment, because if we did loosen this up to saying once a quarter that's not an emergency, under however we describe an emergency, in theory, if everybody maxed that out, we could have 36, essentially on average about 1 a week, plus whatever family and other emergencies we'd have. So that could be quite a few. So it's important for us to kind of think through the ramifications of whatever change we're proposing. Mark?
I mean, if we have the fallback of, you know, plus these extraordinary circumstances, I'd be fine with it being once every 6 months, you know, and
Twice a year?
yeah, I'm fine with that.
I would just say I think that might be a more cautious liberalization, and see, Corey?
Speaking only for myself, obviously, I actually don't have a problem with, you know, remote participation. If somebody's up on the screen using Skype or something, some other teleconferencing, and they're also utilizing a text chat to signal to the mayor and the city clerk that they'd like an opportunity to speak, and perhaps using that also for voting. You know, at least if we can get the technology squared away, I don't see it as problematic. And so having 2 or 4 per year, I'm totally open to either of those.
I mean, sorry.
Tom?
Yeah, I'd prefer the once a quarter. I would actually go more the other way, which would be the once per quarter, and then if there was an emergency, you needed an exception to that, more what Jim was suggesting. Again, I don't know how often this happened in the past, but again, with the language here that is discouraged, I don't think it's likely that we're going to get in those maximum scenarios. And if we do, we can change the rules again. So.
Well, that brings up the question whether it should be once a quarter plus the emergencies, or once a quarter and emergencies are petitioned, or once every 6 months and emergencies are petitioned. We got a few different variations of this. I would just say let's not go too far from one direction to another. And we can always loosen it up a little bit more. I'd recommend that we try a change that's a modest liberalization, but not a significant one, because it got tightened up because we had a problem before with it being too loose.
So the other thing I started to say was this first sentence, that these rules shall apply to boards and commissions as well. We might want to loosen it up for ourselves and see how it works before we apply it to everything.
I would tend to agree. Let's try it for a year, and we haven't conferred with boards and commissions to see their thoughts too. So let's go to this. Doesn't look like we're really we're close, but not necessarily in consensus on whether we go once a quarter or twice a year, whether we have that plus emergencies, or whether the emergencies are petitioned to the council. I'm trying to remember when someone used that actual emergency rule. We've had people who have participated, and it really wasn't according to this procedure, but I don't recall anybody doing so because it was a family health emergency versus other extenuating circumstances. So it's probably that's not going to get exercised very often, is my point. If we kept that in there, given that it doesn't get exercised much, if we say, you know, whether it's twice a year or 4 times a year, we allow it, other than for this emergency, and the emergency's in there, and we make sure that people don't breach that and use that for 5 or 6 times a year when it wasn't an emergency, then I think that might be fine by me to keep it in there. Because I can see where we might have a council member who is laid up recovering from surgery for a month and just can't come to the meetings, might be a mile away, but can't sit up here on the dais, and we don't want to exclude that person. I think that's a fair thing.
Though that person would have to go to a public place, right? I mean, we had this hospital scenario. But,
no, they actually would have to have their front door open if they post on their front door.
Okay.
Yeah. Which gets, depending on the storminess of the weather, it's problematic. Okay, so are we okay with whatever number we leave in as the non-emergency, that we keep the emergency as is? Corey?
I'm not sure if it helps or if it's, maybe I'm being too nitpicky, but I'd say scratch out the word similar where it says similar emergency, just medical need, family need, or emergency.
We're in right now.
What's that?
Yeah. So I think
right.
similar is fine,
Okay.
because it gives some latitude, and we don't know what that might mean.
Weren't we gonna strike emergency though because of the conflict with the 5-day rule? I mean, you just make it similar event or something rather than emergency? I mean,
Yes.
Yeah. One of those words should go away.
Okay, so we strike, replace emergency with event, but the question is, are we okay with leaving the rest of that sentence in there?
I think that's fine.
Okay, now let's see whether we can decide on, outside of that, 2 or 4 times a year.
Split the difference, go 3, so if we can't decide.
Yeah, maybe so.
I'm fine with that.
And are we saying, so I was saying once a quarter, which meant not 3 times in 1 month and then nothing the rest of the year. Are we saying 3 times a year whenever you want?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, all right. So the recommendation is 3 times a year. Not greater than, but we keep in there actively discouraged.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's going to be up to the council member and the mayor to work that out. All right.
Sorry, one last point. So
Yeah.
we are going to have the city attorney review the 5 Brown.
All these things,
clauses.
when we go through, if there's an appropriate legal question before it comes back, the attorney will do that. She does that without us asking her. Okay. And then do we want to treat closed sessions or open sessions any differently?
I don't see any, I mean, I'd say no. Just if we're, I mean, 3 is a decent amount, a decent number of times. I think that should be able to apply to open and close. And
Yeah.
If not,
And it would, you don't get to have 3 open and 3 closed. They're council meetings, so.
Yeah.
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 Okay. Everybody okay? Okay.
Sounds good to me.
Okay. And Beth, you got that we're not going to include the line about this applying to boards and commissions. So then we have a question of what does apply to boards and commissions. Do they have their own rules? So if we don't speak to them to whether they can have remote participation, what applies? Do we know?
Maybe I can take a shot at that. most boards and commissions do have an internal set of guidelines or rules. And I don't know whether they specifically address this topic, but they certainly could do that.
Okay.
Could I make a suggestion? Which I think the only thing we don't want to have apply is this 3 times per year clause. So we can just make that clause specific to council members only and leave the rest of it as is.
And that was exactly what I was going to recommend, so I support that fully.
Okay, so then what we want to do is have wording that reflects that everything else applies to boards and commissions, except the exception for 3 times a year to council members only applies to council members. Okay. Let me see. Forgot everything. I think we did.
Can I just clarify, did you on the cellular telephones change the language? You know,
Yep.
something that says, you know, cellular telephones may only be used in the speaker mode to participate in teleconference
Right.
meetings? Okay.
Yeah, Corey?
Yeah, and also, perhaps we should clarify something that Councilmember Berman was mentioning earlier, which is, you know, just an overall request to staff.
Yeah, I think that was given.
Yeah, to
Okay.
go through and look for not only changes in the jurisprudence, but also changes in technology. And so when this comes back to full council, to include recommendations reflecting modern technology.
Yeah, I
would be
think
one
that
of them.
was
Right, so I just want to reiterate.
Okay, well, we just need to be able to say that was treated as a consensus, and then we don't have to talk long on it.
Right,
Okay.
since it came up again, I just want to make sure we're clear on that.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Okay, consent calendar. So we had a number of possible changes to consent calendar, and each of them, I would say, in isolation, have some merit. In the aggregate, they have the potential of taking a problem that we are going to then be addressing in meeting management and compounding the difficulty potentially significantly. So, and I really mean this seriously. I could be convinced to support most of these recommendations under the consent calendar changes in isolation. But I think we got a real problem if we start significantly opening the door toward a whole bunch more items coming off consent onto action. So I just want to frame that, and let's open it up from there. Corey?
Well, so there's something that's not, at least I don't see it, and maybe I missed it, there's something that's not identified in the manual, but is in our ordinances, which is for individual review, the requirement of 4 votes rather than 3, combined with, if you look on page 9 of the manual or page 18 of the packet, item H, where it says the city manager's office should be advised in writing of a request for removal no later than noon the day of the meeting. There's a lack of clarity here, and I think we've actually seen examples.
Okay, well, let's just, first, let's not go into arguing that point. Let's add it to our list of things that we will discuss.
That's fine. I was just trying to make clear, you know,
Yeah.
I see this as problematic and worth discussing whether we want to change
Well,
the
that
numbers
issue
for IR.
applies beyond the IR review.
Right.
Okay.
So those are the 2 questions. 1, for IR review, and 2, how we go about notifying the city manager.
Right.
Oh, Tom, go ahead.
Tom?
Well, I just wanted to point out that I think you can easily group some of these items. I think there's 5 listed, but there's really 3 and 2 duplicates largely. And so maybe it's worth trying to pick the one that's highest priority for all of us to talk about first.
Yeah, and let me just point folks to the procedures, page 9. That's where we have consent items. Are they anywhere else, or is that correct place?
The rules could be better organized. They do sort of loop around in a few places. So I will take a look and see if I can quickly identify all the places where we talk about consent.
Okay. And that actually is one other cleanup issue is that we may not want to tackle tonight, but whether there's ways to make these organized in any way that's more clear. Okay, so let's just see what thoughts we have about these individually, and then we can struggle with how many of them we might want to consider. And then if we do consider a lump of them, what's the impact on our meeting management? So first, under brief comments, we have this situation where you only get to comment if you voted no, but you can't say anything. And as I read it, you can't even ask a question, even if it's clarifying, which might influence whether you're going to vote yes or might influence others. The trade-off is that we don't want to get each consent item into a mini debate, which defeats the purpose of them being on consent. So, Mark?
So and this is a kind of global concern that'll probably apply to all of these, but right now I wouldn't support council members being able to make oral comments to consent items. I think council members can ask questions. Those questions and answers are circulated to the rest of the council. A council member can submit comments written and have those circulated at the meeting if that's something that they want. But I don't think that we need to take up time at the meeting for every council member to make a comment, have the opportunity to make a comment on every consent item.
Tom?
I think I largely agree with that. Yeah, I think your chance to ask questions is before the meeting on consent items. So.
Okay. Corey, we just heard from Mark and Tom on the first B1, which is a disinclination to allow comments on consent. That's what they voiced.
I actually think that if it's very, very brief, I think that the opportunity to have brief comments stipulated might be good. We've seen people either abstaining or voting no on consent calendar just so they'd have an opportunity to speak, even though they didn't really want to vote no, but they really wanted to speak their piece. And so I'd say give them the chance to do that. Maybe include language such as actively discourage, but I think that people are kind of twisting their own votes in order to find an opportunity to speak. I'm okay with allowing something brief.
So I have noticed that, and it's fairly recent phenomena, that the frustration of not being able to speak to something that on consent that they may be willing to vote for, but had something important that they felt was important to say, is causing some people to vote no just so they can say it. That's kind of counterproductive. Now, we could include language that addresses that and say that's discouraged. And when people figure out their little workarounds, you try and figure out how do you prevent a workaround. So let's put that one aside for the moment. We've heard kind of where people are coming from, and maybe as we look at the other things, when we'll loop back to it.
Let me,
Mark?
I mean, as I've thought about, and when we look back to it, one thing we could consider is a number of items that one could speak to and a time duration of, I would say, 60 seconds at most.
Oh, yeah.
That'd be okay with 30 seconds. So, we could draft rules that could limit the damage potential.
Okay, thanks.
Mr. Chairman?
yeah.
When we come back to it, I have a couple of implications there I would like to point out, but I'm just wondering if the committee does want to think about maybe being a little explicit too about either what is the problem that you're trying to solve or the improvement that is driving the fact to make the change, that's clear. So something worth thinking about.
Yeah. And one consideration that we should noodle on is whether if we allow an occasional comment of limited duration, would we have fewer things pulled from consent? And it's worth considering that. I'm not saying that would necessarily be the case, but let's think that through.
Could I just add to that? That was one of the things, you could have the opposite effect too, right? I mean, to the extent that somebody's making comments to try to push to get an item pulled, and then somebody says, oh, well, that's a really good point. Now, on the one hand, that could be a really good canary in a coal mine issue. On the other hand, you know, it...
I mean, we'll get to that with this next item.
Good, okay. That's right, so this next item may influence our thinking on the other. We used to have, the council used to have a rule of only 2 votes required to remove an item from consent, and a few years ago it got up to 3 in the interest of trying to speed things along in meetings.
And 4 for IR, right?
Yeah, but that's, let's leave that one separately. So this is just other, the 95% of 8% of consent items, okay. So let's, Tom?
So I'm reading the notes from the retreat and stuff. I guess they might have been your comments, which you just said again, which is, and then I'm looking at, again, on page 10 and 11, the 5 types of consent items. I don't see the one that talks about appeals. And so I think in particular, not to speak for you, Corey, but you know, the idea was, especially for an appeal where citizens have paid money, do we want to consider changing whether they can be heard or not? So I guess which of these 5 items actually is a category for appeals?
Thank you, Councilmember Du Bois. Those rules are in our code, in our zoning code. And they're in different places in the code depending on the type of appeal.
Okay.
So the council certainly could take up changes to those procedures, but some of them might require ordinances that would change the code.
Okay. So I meant to, as we talk about these rules for consent items, we might want to have them apply to only certain categories of item. So it's just something to think about.
All right, any initial thoughts on whether we want to consider returning to 2 votes to remove an item? Corey?
Actually, I'll let Mark go first.
Mark?
So I'm open to the idea that Tom mentioned of you know, maybe different categories being treated differently, but on the whole, my inclination is going to be to keep it at 3. And the reason for that is, you know, we have the ability, and I think this might get changed when the council goes down to 7, but right now we have the ability to talk to 3 additional council members before a meeting and not violate the Brown Act. You can get a sense for whether or not there's going to be support for something if it is placed on an action item, and I don't think it's. Sorry, I'm not being very coherent at all this entire evening, but if you can't find 2 other colleagues to go with you to pull something off of consent, the odds are you're not going to find 4 other colleagues to go with you to actually support your position on action. And so I think 3 out of 9 is a kind of minimal threshold to show that it might actually be a different resolution than approval on consent. And I just think that's a sensible minimal threshold to have to achieve.
Other comments? Corey?
Yep, and I know you said you kind of want to handle it separately, but you know, my inclination is actually to just make it 3 universally. You know, that nothing should require 4, but I think I agree with Councilmember Berman's comments that I don't think that there's a need to reduce any of the items that go into consent to a 2-vote threshold to pull from consent. I think that, especially if we do allow for brief comments at the start, I think that I just don't see a need to go from 3 to 2, but I do strongly feel that we should make sure that nothing requires more than 3 votes to pull.
Well, let me get that clarification. Is the IR review in zoning code on 4?
It is, and it's the only one off the top of my head that I'm aware of that requires 4.
Okay.
If there are others, they haven't been used in recent years, and I'm not aware of them. That is a zoning change, and I would just offer to council members, I believe it was adopted as part of a carefully calibrated system that does allow some outlet for individual review, but makes a high threshold for essentially small projects that are single-family homes, impacting a smaller number of the members of this community. It certainly could be changed, but it would need to go through the process to change a zoning ordinance, which would mean that there would be a hearing at the Planning and Transportation Commission, come back to the council for 2 readings.
And if we were to make such a recommendation tonight, it would have to be dealt with separately from these procedures, because these are all within things we can simply recommend to council. All right, so let's take comments from others on whether IR review, you think we should have reconsider that to the threshold that we have for everything else, or whether it should stay at 4. Mark?
I mean, to be honest, I don't know enough to comment on that right now. I'd want to get a better understanding of why the decision was made in the first place before I'd kind of weigh in on that.
Okay. Tom?
Again, I don't know whose idea it was, but it's kind of an interesting one, which is there was an idea of reducing the threshold to 3 if they showed a certain number of supporters that weren't co-appellants. So if somebody showed up with a petition of 50 residents, they would probably get 4 votes at the same time. So
That's right. I agree.
yeah.
Corey?
Yeah, and honestly, this is informed by an experience that, we had, this year, where there was an effort made to abide by the procedures, to follow the procedures to the letter. And I think that it's really the combination of requiring 4 votes and requiring notification or procedures calling for notification of the city manager in advance, which encourages people to communicate outside of the council, reaching out to very close to a violation of the Brown Act. I think it invites accidents. In general, it's wise to, I think we'd agree, wise to not talk to a group with a group of 4 because of the chance of a mistake, because you don't want to violate the Brown Act. And here we're basically inviting people to dance right on the edge of Brown Act violations by requiring notification to the city manager in advance and requiring the 4 votes. And that's the reason for my concern. So either changing the notification process or changing the ability to comment at the start of discussion of consent calendar, or changing the vote threshold, or some combination of those, I'd be open to. So
I have down the notice to the city manager as one of the additional items under consent. And as we've seen, that several of these interplay with each other. But let's take that on separately, because it has a broader impact than just on the IR.
It may. I just want to be clear that, my concern is obviously.
Well, we heard it.
Okay.
We're going to have a long night, so
All right.
let's state our concerns once. Okay, so is there a consensus that we want to either have additional discussion about this, or well, Marcus said that he wants to think about it more.
I mean, I'd be okay if you guys want. I'm fine if there's a consensus to move.
Okay, Tom, what's your thoughts?
This is specifically on IR going from 4 to
Yes.
3? Yeah, I mean, I guess I would support going to 3, but I don't feel super strongly.
How about this? We're going to have the rest of these items come back. We're going to have a second Policy and Services Committee meeting that will be the red line version. Why don't we roll this over to that meeting and let people think about it more?
The IR aspect.
Yep.
Yep.
Sounds good to me.
Because that's a zoning change. Okay. So then we've got the number 4 there is whether the brief comments related to opposition can be made.
Did we resolve 3-2?
Oh, further items.
No, so I'm doing one pass
Okay.
to see if we have consensus.
I see.
And then we kind of are going to look at these in aggregate and see if we can make some decisions. If something's, we've got 4-0 and it's easy, we take it off the list.
I'm with you.
Yeah, because they interplay so much. Okay. We allow comments after a no vote, but not before a no vote. And we say, I'm trying to remember the wording when this permissible comments, let's see, I'm on page 9 somewhere, or where is it? How long, I think it's 3 minutes we allow, right?
I think so.
Yeah. So would we want to allow comments beforehand or keep it the way it is if somebody's going to vote no? Right now, you're only allowed to comment if you vote no, and you're only allowed to comment after the vote. Yeah.
I'm going to restate the obvious. I mean, the way it works right now, the intent of the council member being able to vote is to explain their no vote. If you do it beforehand, there's the opportunity to influence the vote. And so,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts? Mark?
I mean, I agree. I think it's fine the way it is.
Anybody else?
Mr. Chairman, may I have
Yeah.
one other thought? It seems to me that, I mean, the reason for consent items are really to allow the council to read the things and to vote on them quickly. If there is a concern about taking up, you have the ability to pull it off the consent calendar versus trying to influence prior to making a vote. And in one sense, there's a little bit of conflict between this one, pull it off and clearly all discuss it versus, you know, here's the situation. You could have the situation where you have to pull it off and you get the 2 or 3 votes, whatever it is, and you do it. You could have another one where everybody's almost ready to vote and the last person says, oh, well, wait, I'm going to vote no, but let me tell you why I'm going to vote no. And it's potentially a de facto same thing as pulling it a little bit, and it's a little confusing.
So in answer to Tom's question, I may be influenced by how we respond to number 5. So how about if we set this one aside a little bit and go to number 5, which is consider what items, and wasn't there additional, oh, maybe it's, yeah, I think over on the next page, we had some other comments, didn't we, about this? Somewhere, I thought I read there were additional comments about the sorts of things that should be on consent in the report. Now I'm trying to find it. There was somewhere that I saw something in greater depth. Maybe it was in, I'm not sure, I'm sorry. So, well, let's reflect on, we've had a number of items that get pulled from consent, and then we get some items that are removed from consent because the city manager or the mayor recognize that they're contentious enough, even though they, either based on the public feedback we're getting or council member concerns or some other reason, that they say, well, it's really appropriate that this item go on action. On the face of it, it might look like a consent calendar item, but it's not because it hit the dollar threshold, but because it hits a raw nerve with a significant portion of the public or members of the council. So we also have that way in which items get removed consent. And I'll add one other that just has recently come up through a standing committee, where if we have a unanimous vote, it goes to consent. And we had an item on our finance committee where one of our colleagues advocated very strongly for a unanimous vote so that it would avoid a council discussion. And my understanding of the reason that we have items from standing committees automatically going to consent unless the mayor or the city manager elects to remove it, or the council does through their formal procedure, is for efficiency only. It's not for political purposes. And we might want to consider language that simply says, where we talk about unanimous votes from standing committees go on consent, we say, however, that should not be done for political purposes. And we have that that's the kind of thing that goes in our protocols more than our procedures. So when, that may be something that we can, one, see whether we think that's a correct concept, and then we could go back and when we go line by line, figure out where that belongs. So let me just ask that one, because that's one that is an additional example. And then we have other examples of things that have been pulled from consent, and we go, okay, this is causing people to ask, do we need to tweak what goes on consent automatically? So the one I just brought up, any thoughts on, do you agree or disagree with?
Well, was that more a concern about things going on consent, or kind of the motivations behind it?
It's the motivation to attempt to put something, get it on consent to achieve a political purpose.
Yeah, no, and I think that's inappropriate. And we've even had on, I think we had on finance last year, one time where we put something on action that was approved 4-0 because we thought it was something that our colleagues would want to.
That's right.
Weigh in on.
Kind of that's the more appropriate deference to the council as a whole.
Yeah.
And some of these things, we don't have necessarily stated because we haven't had people in the past who necessarily did some of these things. And when it comes up and you see them, you go, okay, do we need a guideline that says that's not what we mean?
I mean, it sounds like a good idea, but at the same time, any member of that committee, every member of that committee, finance committee, whatever, should realize that and not vote for political reasons. So, I mean,
but unless it's in the protocol, someone who says, gee, that's not appropriate, doesn't have a leg to stand on.
Okay. So if I could speak to the dollar amount one?
Well, let's just see if we can take this. I want to try to get things off the table.
Yeah.
So does that seem like a good concept that we want to just add that clarification on the intent? Corey?
Yeah, and adding it to the end, I think, is probably the right place to do it. I think that makes sense.
Okay. Tom, you're next time.
Well, so I think the question of dollar amount's an interesting question. Is there some threshold where a consent item is such a large item that there's a fiduciary responsibility of the council to discuss it?
There is not currently in the rules, and many very large items are quite routine.
Right. So it sounds like a difficult one, but it also is one potentially where the public gets upset, right? That there's this large amount of money that wasn't discussed, and it turns out to be controversial. So.
And I'll say the distinction is between, there are big dollar amounts that are essentially not highly discretionary decisions. We have a contract for a utility buy. It's a lot of money, and there's no debate. Never has been, probably rarely ever will be. And other things that might be smaller dollar amounts, but they're discretionary and maybe they reflect value decisions or priorities or whatever. And that's, I think, what we're talking about. So I would say I don't think the dollar amount is an effective trigger. Others?
I mean, I think that's right. I mean, I think you'll just get things caught in there that shouldn't be, and you might not address some of the instances that you're trying to address of smaller dollar things that are controversial. So I mean, so that's not a satisfying resolution to this problem, and maybe we need to find a different resolution to the issue than a dollar amount. Although, you know, the different resolution could just be getting a couple of council members to pull something off the consent. But you'd capture too much with I think with a dollar amount that you wouldn't really even want to.
Corey?
Yeah, actually, having something placed on consent originally, I don't think is problematic. I don't think that having something placed on the consent calendar, but published and announced, is in any way avoiding public scrutiny, in any way avoiding public disclosure, or not transparent. And there's clearly an opportunity for members of the public to speak about items that are on consent, and an opportunity for, I think the more important issue is how we get things off of consent when we disagree with the conclusions that have been reached, with all due respect, by the staff and by the mayor in crafting the agenda. So I don't think that there's a need to restrict what goes on consent. I think the important thing is that we have the opportunity to pull things from consent when we identify, oh, here's a nerve that's touched, as you said, by other council members or by the public.
And I think we may end up wanting to look at, in protocols, wait a minute, I always get those procedures, protocols, whether we want some guidance just talking about the consent items not being non-controversial, and that's basically the intent. And that's not prescriptive, it's a reminder. And that's basically what the purpose of it. Jim?
Yes, if I might add, I do think that the dollar amount is really potentially, I mean, even almost ham-handed. It doesn't signify a tip. I mean, actually, we could probably demonstrate that more often than not, the largest expenditures are the simplest because they're bulk purchases of, let's just say, asphalt for our street program, and it's $2.5 million. Whereas we could have a $50,000 expenditure on a neighborhood issue. Do you know what I mean? Something that has a policy implication. The other thing I think we should remember is, why are these things coming to the council in the first place? For the most part, because there are other drivers that are saying they need to go. And there are other tests that you use to manage them. We have a code that requires fair and competitive bidding. So all of these are bids for the most part that have to meet that test. More often than not, the biggest expenses have been in the CIP and have already been vetted and approved by the council. So I mean, I think we need to do a better job of maybe articulating to the public that there's already been levels of council review on these matters, and these are in many ways ministerial. The thing that matters is, did we follow up the fair and appropriate process for awarding a contract? But that has nothing to do with a dollar amount necessarily. And then there are other issues really about, again, I think the issue are the matters that signify some sense of policy change, or those situations where there is existing policy, but the times have changed in some way that it's out of step with where the council might see the community or something in some way. And in that sense, just administering it's a problem.
Yeah, I can definitely see where a $10,000 contract to paint all of our utility boxes candy cane red would come off a consent. Yeah. All right, so it sounds like we have a consensus that we are not interested in setting a dollar amount, but we may want to have guidance language that helps clarify the sorts of things that come off of consent. And I think that would be as we look at line and verse on some of these things. And then, let's see, have we gone through all of these? The issue on notice to the city manager 1 week in advance. Mm-hmm. And the problem, I think...
or day in advance.
I'm sorry?
It's a day in advance, not a week. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Even noon the day of the meeting. Page 9 of the manual, page 18 of the packet, item H.
Wait, just a second, please.
So
Wait,
it's,
just a second.
Page 9 of the manual, page 18 of the packet, item H, the second sentence.
Just so we're clear right now, that's the existing language. We've sort of been operating since the new timeframe for the 11-day release of asking the council to inform the city manager by the Sunday evening before the Monday meeting. So it's a little bit more like a full day. Right now, this says no later than noon of the day of the meeting. So it's
So here's the problem with that. I think that's a good practice, and that we should be attempting to do that wherever we can. It's a little bit strong language that says should, that it makes it sound like it's a violation by the council members if we hear from members of the public at the meeting on reasons to pull it and say, you know, I've just been convinced, and we don't want the city manager to feel that we did something inappropriately. Or we can speak with colleagues, and there may be emerging appreciation of why a item should be pulled, and we just didn't have that conclusion a full day in advance. So I would be more comfortable with something that says should be advised whenever possible, or something that slightly softens it. Doesn't make it look like we're breaking a rule, but that we have a practice that we should be attempting wherever possible to abide by.
if I might add,
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, we would be supportive of that. With language, it clearly signals that this is the practice of the intention, but it's not so prescriptive that you violated it. Just to be clear, I mean, the reason for this, which is different than pulling an item, there are a couple of reasons, which is, number one, if you're not going to pull an item, I don't have to have the staff sitting here waiting for the item to come up in a meeting. They can have a study session, comment, and they sit here for 2 hours, and it's for no purpose. So the idea of getting the early notice to be able to release people. So what I would say, with just the understanding that if there are last-minute changes, probably more often than not, I might say, you can pull this, but there's no way we can take it up tonight. We're going to have to reschedule it because the staff is not here. Every now and then, we'll have a situation probably where the item is so time-sensitive that doesn't work. But I think that that's relatively rare. I mean, I'd say usually, if there's something that's going to be an issue that in some way in the community, we have some sense of that, even if it's on consent.
Right. So in addition to not making it so prescriptive, I think we'd want to add something that you want to be notified as much in advance as possible. So if we knew 3-4 days in advance, you'd prefer that. And if we knew, 4 hours in advance, but didn't know a day in advance, you'd still want to hear it.
Absolutely.
Okay. So we're going. Let me ask whether we have consensus that that's the intent, that we want it a little less prescriptive, but we also want to encourage the city manager to receive notice as early as possible. Mm-hmm. Okay. So we have to figure out what words describe that, but that's the intent. I have one other, right above it in G. I realized that there was ambiguity to me in what this meant. So this is, if members of the public wish to speak on consent, the mayor will have the option of allowing the testimony prior to the adoption of the consent calendar or removing the item from the consent calendar. So first, I had forgotten that the mayor can, as a chair action, remove an item from a consent calendar. So we do have a question. Does that seem like?
Chair Bird, I don't believe that it means that.
Oh.
I believe that it allows the mayor.
See, there's that ambiguity again.
Yeah, I think that this sentence is very
to be cleaned
confusing.
up,
And
yeah.
in practice, as we've tried to apply it, it can mean a lot of different things.
Okay.
So I think one of the confusions is that before, sometimes the council has been assisting the public by very early on in the consent calendars indicating that it intends to remove an item. Where that hasn't happened, the council may actually not have been able to notify the city manager because you're not really sure that you want to do that, but the public wants to speak to the removal, not necessarily to how you will substantively handle the item. So it doesn't make any sense for them to speak after the vote is taken to approve the consent calendar because you've already done the action. So, you know, I think we need to clarify the two types of public comment that are relevant.
So what is this other clause trying to say in your mind?
Can you point out the page?
Yes, so it's page 9G, third line.
That's page 18 of the packet as provided for us.
I would not read that to authorize the mayor on the mayor's sole initiative to remove an item from the consent calendar, but rather I think that's intended to say that if the sufficient number of council members have indicated they wish to remove the item, the mayor has the decision to allow the public comment right when the consent calendar is called, or not allow public comment, allow the item to be removed, and then put the public comment at the time that the item is heard.
That's consistent with our practice, and so if we were to assume that what Molly just described is in fact what the intent was, and it's aligned with the practice, do we want to just authorize Molly and the clerk to come back with language reflecting with what she just described?
Yes, please.
Okay?
I hate to ask this, could you say it one more time? Because I was having a hard time following you.
I'm not sure she didn't write it out.
It was so different
this would
from
be
what
an interesting test of Molly.
Because what you described, I don't have
Okay.
legal
So
understanding, but it was very different from my reading.
Yes, we have been the clerk and the staff have, and the council have been in favor of generously interpreting these rules. So if people want to speak about removing an item from consent, we allow that. And then if the item were then removed, we would allow public comment again when the item is substantively scheduled, if it were scheduled on another night. Probably if it were scheduled on that night, we would discourage people from making comment again. But I think we need to clarify that folks do have an opportunity to address the council on the question of removal itself. And that, yeah, I think we can work with the language, Chair Burt.
All right, so let's see if we can pretty quickly revisit the open items under consent. I think we didn't see, Tom?
So going back to these open items, again, I've been thinking about the categories, and the one I'm struggling with is appeals. So I wanted to throw out an idea, which is if somebody pays their money for an appeal, what if we allow them to speak for 10 minutes on that consent item before there's a vote? Not change the number of votes to remove from consent, but at least give them a chance to speak. Because what can happen now is you pay your money, it's on consent, if it's not pulled off, you don't get to say anything.
Let's see. The public is allowed to speak before, they get their 3 minutes.
They get 3 minutes, but they
so
get that without paying their money, they get their 3
No,
minutes.
I just want to clarify, when you
Yeah.
said they don't get to say anything, they get 3 minutes.
Yeah, so I
Okay.
guess the question is, if they paid $400, whatever it is, can they speak for 10 minutes and have a
Or
chance?
some other number, maybe 5 or whatever.
Yeah, have a
some
chance
additional
to
time.
get the vote to pull it off consent.
I mean, I'd probably be okay with that. I mean, you can also get a group of people together, and I'd rather they get 4 of the people together to get the 10 minutes that way, because you just because.
Just demonstrates
But
support.
yeah, but I'd be okay with. I mean, I can see the concern behind that.
Yeah, I think in principle, it's probably in the right direction. I don't know whether 10 minutes is, we need to go that far. I'm kind of thinking about whether 5 minutes would allow somebody to state their case in addition to the written appeal. I mean, this is really, it's not the, this is enough of a case to convince the council to remove it from consent, as opposed to the merits of the case itself. So that's something to think about. All right, well, let's keep that on the table. We just, I think people are going to take a few minutes to think about it. And so that'll be one of our remaining open items. So let me go to the other open items and we'll revisit that one if that's okay. Because I think on most of these things, often our thought processes are that if, you know, as part of why I've been asking, let's have preliminary thoughts, and unless we have real clarity and simplicity, revisit, because it lets us digest it a little bit. Okay. We're not going to do anything on changing to 2 votes for routine items, nor on the strict dollar amount, nor other changes on prescribing what goes on consent. Is that correct? That's what I captured? Sorry? Yeah, okay. So then we had, we said we were going to revisit this issue of whether any brief comments related to opposition may occur before the vote. We heard, you know, this whole question, does it then move those comments into persuasion rather than clarification? Is there anybody who still wants to kind of argue in favor of allowing comments before a consent item is voted on? Corey?
Yeah, I would argue that, you know, this is the time, or that would be the opportunity for a council member who was not involved in the drafting of, you know, what went on consent or what didn't go on consent to say, you know, this touches a nerve with me. This touches a nerve with members of the community with whom I've spoken about this issue. I understand why it was placed on consent, but I think in this case it is enough of a controversial item that we ought to pull it, and I hope that there are 2 colleagues here who will join me in pulling it. I think that that is exactly the right time for that. So I think that there should be an opportunity. Restricting it to 30 seconds or 60 seconds I think is absolutely appropriate. I think, you know, what I just said as an example here, 30 or 60 seconds should be totally doable. Maybe restrict it to a single item, but even that I'm not positive is necessary. I think that the time limit on how long you speak about it is more appropriate. But yeah, I think it's definitely worth doing.
Others? And let me just say that when we can have certain items that if we get a couple of things that we can't decide on tonight, we're going to get a red line version the next time we have the agenda, and we could have a couple things that are holdovers if we're still struggling with something tonight. So I'm for myself, I'm thinking about what Corey just described of if we had 2 limitations of a council member can only speak to 1 item and a very restrictive time limit, would I be open to that, or at least a trial period of it? I don't know. I'm thinking about it. Tom?
I think, again, several of these items are getting tied together for me. It's like, well, if we do this, then I'm okay with that.
Right.
So I think I'm okay with what Corey described and what you just described. 1 item, 60 seconds. I assume that means you do not also get to talk after you vote no. So you'd speak once, not twice.
Yes.
The other one, you just went over the number of votes to stay on consent. Again, I'm still thinking of it by categories, and if we allowed the appellant to have a few extra minutes to speak, then I think I'm fine with leaving the votes where they are. If we weren't, you know, I might want to come back and talk about fewer votes for appeals.
Okay.
So if I could just clarify, city manager and I were talking about this confusing question of public comment, and we think we just need to write a clear rule that matches our current practice, which is if you show up and you want to speak on the consent calendar, you will be allowed to do that for 3 minutes unless the mayor's reducing the time to 2 minutes.
We were talking about letting them have more than 3 minutes if they would.
If you paid for an appeal. Okay, so we have two open items on this. Pardon me?
Well, no, I just want to restate something that was said a while ago as it relates to the IR issue a little bit too, and that is, just so we're clear, that these matters that are solely within the procedures and protocols are actions that are resolutions of the council, will go to the council. These issues, both the IR question on the number and this one on the appeal, are both items that, as the city attorney said, are in the municipal code in our zoning ordinances, and so they require changes. Both of those have other aspects of change that are under consideration in various ways. I mean, the staff is going to be coming back on IR. So I would think your recommendations on this would be more like, when the council takes up the issue of amendments or changes to this process, P&S had recommended X, Y, Z, rather than necessarily, I mean, unless you somehow feel, well, they can be done out of context.
Well, I think the number of minutes that an appellant could speak if they paid for an
Right.
appeal could be out of context.
I only say it because to do that, still, does that require a change in the zoning ordinance or not? Okay. No, I'm just saying, if the vehicle is have to change the zoning ordinance, that's a little bit of a different process. If that you can change it by your protocols on these appeals without.
Yeah,
having to
we
change
don't
the
need
zoning
as,
ordinance.
yeah.
Okay, she's saying she have to change it. So I'm just saying you
Pardon?
could have such.
If the zoning ordinance requires 4 votes, you would not be able to change that by adopting a resolution changing
No,
these
but what we were talking about is whether we can change how long an appellant can speak. Just that. So if we say that if somebody paid for an appeal and it's on consent, can we authorize the mayor to say, or the rule to be, that they can speak for 5 minutes? That's all we're talking about.
I'm almost certain that there are no speaking time limits in the ordinance, that those are in the rule, and
Yeah.
you would be able to do that.
I'd be really surprised. Okay.
And we'll resolve that, but my point was, if it is the ordinance, sometimes it gets
Right.
confusing because of the process to go twice at it. you know.
Right. Yeah, Court?
Yeah, so, quick question then, also a suggestion on this issue. I'm also thinking about it and haven't really made up my mind, but at the point where it's coming to council and it's on consent, if there's been an appeal filed and money has been paid for that appeal, but it's on consent, that usually means that the planning director has already found in opposition to the appeal in favor of the project.
Applicant, yeah.
Correct, the applicant, is that correct?
What has happened is the planning director has had a recommendation, not in the case of IR, that's a staff level recommendation, and sometimes it's an ARB recommendation, and that the planning commissioner, the planning director has made a decision on, which is a final decision unless appealed, and appeal has been filed. So it's not that the director has considered the appeal is from the director's decision.
Great, okay. Got it.
Okay. So we have these two open items.
Actually, sorry, just a
yeah.
quick comment on that. If we do change the times for the appellant, I would just also suggest, as a matter of course, that we also simultaneously change times for applicants. So.
No, okay, so I would disagree with that because.
Oh, but we're just talking about pulling from consent, so.
That's right.
All right. Yeah, never mind.
Okay.
Never mind.
And I would say that if colleagues are comfortable with increasing the speaking time to 5 minutes on a consent calendar item for the appellant, I'm okay with recommending it at this time. If it's longer than that, I'd want to think about this more. Okay, then we have a consensus of 5 minutes. All right, so then the open item is this thing to think about more on whether we would allow very brief comments for a single item, and you wouldn't get to speak before and after the vote.
Do you want to push that for the next meeting?
I do unless there's consensus now, and I didn't really hear it, and I was still struggling with it, so.
I think I'm in favor of it.
Go ahead.
I'd be in favor of it. one item, 60 seconds.
Mark, your
I could be
thoughts?
okay with, I could be okay with trying that out. I mean, it's,
So,
if it helps
Yeah.
address the problem of, you know, the
Yeah.
issue that came up earlier of people voting against things just to talk about it. It covers both.
how about this? I'm sort of leaning that way, but I really want to think it through.
I'm fine with
And,
that.
So why don't we have it as a carryover?
I'm not in
Okay,
a rush.
great.
Chair Burt, could you clarify for us? So you're asking on all land use appeals that the appellant?
No, now we're on to just, so the first one thing that we already had a consensus on is what you're describing, that, yes, all land, yeah.
I am. I'm
Okay.
revisiting that. So on all land use appeals, that the appellant gets 5 minutes to speak, an applicant would be under the general 3-minute rule on whether the appeal would be heard. Does that then mean that you don't wish to revisit the voting threshold for IR, polling IR, or do you still wish that to come back to you next time?
That would still come back.
Okay.
Okay, so then this thing that we're talking about right now is, at our next meeting on this, whether we will want to allow brief comments, 60 seconds or whatever, of a single item by a council member from agenda, and that it would, that council member would not be allowed to subsequently speak after the vote, if they voted no. Okay, they could just, instead of 3 minutes after the vote, they could vote, speak 60 seconds before.
Right.
Fun decision to make.
All right, meeting management. Does that apply to tonight?
So Pat, did we, we didn't really address the non-controversial item. What did we do with that?
Which one?
So this idea that consent calendar should be non-controversial items, perhaps not a policy
Right,
change or
so-
policy that's no longer current.
Yeah, kind of a description of what's intended. Yeah, should we go ahead and say that we want language reflecting that consent calendar items should be non-controversial or without significant, I mean, that may be in an eye of the beholder. You know, if we got one member of the community, it should not, they should not have significant controversy on the council or community.
We qualify that language ultimately a little bit, you know, that, you know, every attempt should be made to put items, to not place controversial items on the consent calendar, or that in some way that because I guarantee
Yeah.
there is a
Yeah.
perception.
Yeah.
And somebody say, you put that on.
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
gonna go.
And to put it as make sure that it's in there as a guidance, that the mayor and the city manager, at their discretion, should attempt to not place controversial items on the consent calendar.
Do we want to qualify with this idea of it's related to policy, or is that too narrow?
I think it's a bit narrow, yeah.
Okay.
So is that language sound good? Okay. All right, meeting management.
So you also skipped agenda setting.
Pardon me? Oh,
Once-
I'm sorry. There is that little agenda setting. So let's have a little discussion here. And I'm trying to, I don't know, Beth, if you know where to point us to or anybody does, I didn't go back and look at where that guidance exists in. Is that in the Muni code or in our procedures and protocols on who does agenda management? And how is that done?
I'm not aware that it's in the, I can check again, both the
It's
charter
really
and the
agenda
municipal code.
scheduling we're meeting, right? Not management, because agenda management's within the meeting. So we really should say agenda scheduling. Setting, agenda is setting.
Now that's rescheduling.
Is it 3.7, the mayor?
What page?
I'm on the table of content. It'd be page 36. The mayor and vice mayor should work with staff to plan the council meetings,
That's probably as much as we say about it.
right?
So this is packet page 36?
No, it'll be the procedures and protocols. page.
Protocol.
So that really, we think is intended to not so much be about placement of items on the agenda, but how to put the order, how to, you know, should we take a public comment first or last, that kind of thing.
Okay, so no then.
Well, but I think it's as close as we have to describing our process. So it talks about three purposes of the pre-council meeting. Plan how the meeting will be conducted. Identify any issues or questions that may need greater staff preparation, and discuss future meetings. And the future meetings I construe to mean future agendas. Right. And so I think it does kind of hit the issue that we're talking about. And it really doesn't, it says that the mayor and vice mayor should work with staff. Jim, what does that mean to you? So my understanding from my experience is that it is a collaborative effort, that the city manager is looking at agenda items with a primary thrust of the agenda items that need to go through to either accomplish the efficient working of the government on a routine basis, or to bring forward the items on a timely basis that have received council direction in the past. And I think those are the drivers that you look at within the context of what's ripe and what's most urgent. And then the mayor is going to be deferring on much of that, and then occasionally offering input or recommendations, or even on a rarer occasion a push for an item to be come forward on a given date for whatever reasons of sense of the community or sense of the council.
So
is that a decent description?
While Jim is gathering his thoughts, I'd like to just add, as a matter of interpreting our charter, which sets up a council manager form of government, that the manager's role is slightly broader than you've described. The manager it's incumbent upon the manager to bring forward agenda items that the operations of the city call for the council to pay attention to. And those may be broader.
That's what
I
meant by the first category.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
So it is what you meant. It is slightly broader than routine. It's items that the manager is spotting that warrant and call for guidance from the council. And so he brings those forward. So really most of the agenda items that are coming before the council are initiated by the manager, right, through his staff as well.
Right.
And just so we're clear on that, many of those are already, they have other proscriptions from the council or in the charter, right? So is it thresholds on contracts or all of those things? So I don't have discretion in whether lots of these operational things come forward, but there are others. We clearly bring things to the council that the council maybe not have even known about. We think that it's important, or there's a policy decision that needs to be made.
Right.
And I think really I think we need to own the fact in our organization, our community, we are very much aligned with the culture of this community and the history of this community, the tendency to bring more than less, as it is in many organizations.
So I think the question is, we've heard a description that is generally how it has functioned, and when and especially kind of how that dynamic of the council meetings being here to run the city's business, and yet they're the council's meeting. So that, how do you balance those things? And whether, I'm not hearing, in my mind, a need to change things, but a question of whether we want to have language that more clearly describes what we have had as the reality and what works well. Yeah, Cord?
Well, just going back to the item as it was listed in short form, clarifying the role of the mayor, vice mayor, and city manager. I think we've just had a good discussion about the city manager, but we haven't really dug into the vice mayor in particular and what role, if any, the vice mayor plays in that discussion, in that process. And so that's, yeah.
It's a good point. And in reading this, I actually was surprised that there wasn't more of a distinction of the role of the mayor and the vice mayor. I had, and I think the practice has been that the mayor is given authorities by the council, and the vice mayor, sort of like the vice president's there if the mayor's not there. But that's not the way this one reads, so that's a second issue. So we have the question of, does it adequately describe the dynamic between the city manager and the council's representative or representatives, however we choose to define that, and does it correctly describe the roles of the mayor and the vice mayor?
Yeah, if I might add to that, Pat, I mean, you've obviously been mayor. I think in practice, it's been that way, that the mayor is clearly the lead, the vice mayor is in attendance, certainly asks questions, but it really comes to making sort of decisions or choices. It's not a shared role. And, you know, I don't think it should be a shared role. I mean, I think the council selects the mayor in many ways to be the chief governance officer in a sense, as far as running, you know, I mean, the council's business. And I would add another thing to this, that I think the language is basically pretty good about what the purposes are. I mean, the 3 points, including the end situation, consideration building the agenda to the potential length of the meeting and at what point items of significant public concern may be heard. I think there is a one issue that we do need to acknowledge is that different folks can apply this, interpret things differently, and we don't typically really have this, but whoever is mayor is still one single member of the whole council, and you know, a mayor could have different reasons for something being on the council agenda than the manager does, or not being on, and you know, I think it's a good practice to sort of know that, I don't let me say that the manager trumps the mayor, but it runs into the intersection of other things we have in our procedures about clarifying the staff works for the entire council. You don't take individual direction from an individual council member. So this just needs to be reconciled in practice a little.
So I think that's a good third important question. So do we want to have language that clarifies that it's the obligation of the mayor to reflect the interests of the council as a whole in the agenda setting? Now, that's still very broad and discretionary, but it gives kind of this context for what is the expectation. It's not enforceable.
I mean, it's kind of like the way we act at our, as a liaison, right? We're not supposed to be representing our personal views, but kind of thing. And, you know, it's up to discretion. Yeah.
Let me give you I'll give you a hypothetical example, but I mean, really, I mean, you know, if the mayor were, the person who's in the mayor role is in a situation where there's an item that they just absolutely hate and they don't want it to come to the council, and they keep saying, well, I don't think we should put this on the agenda. And I'm saying, well, this does need to come to the agenda. I mean, we haven't had that situation, but there's always the potential for conflict, and language to be able to point to that this is a liaison, that references this fact that we're working on, all of these are working on behalf of the whole council, including what the manager does is working on behalf of the whole council, not on behalf of the manager.
So I'm thinking possible language might be something to the effect of, one, clarifying that it's the mayor who's representing the council, and the vice mayor is there in conference, but not with the mayor's authority. But second, that the mayor should make something to the effect of best efforts to reflect the interests of the council as a whole. Something along that intent. That may not be the best language ultimately.
That's a good starting point.
Corey.
So, first question, then perhaps a quick comment after that. If the city manager, in meeting with the mayor and the vice mayor, if the city manager is the only one who thinks item X really needs to go on the agenda, and it needs to go there pretty soon, and both the mayor and the vice mayor say, we really don't think it needs to come before council anytime in the next year, what happens in that hypothetical?
I started updating my resume.
Because I think maybe that's the kind of clarification we're considering, discussing, and perhaps implementing.
So I mean, many of these issues still require conversation, but it is very helpful to be able to point to specific language. So even the language that the chair was talking about makes it easier to say, well, really, while this role is here, it does speak to liaison the council as a whole. And I mean, I hate to say it, but I respectfully think there are lots of members of the council who do want to see this item come forward, and this is where you are.
And we do have a process to do that.
Right.
We can, as council members, get things agendized. Okay.
So perhaps we should clarify these three roles and say something along the lines of, maybe along with other things as well, but something along the lines of, beyond the meeting and the conversing and the general guidance about how they should approach their roles, to say that, either the city manager or the mayor can call for something, can make the decision, has the power to decide that something gets placed on the agenda. So that if either the mayor or the city manager, or ideally both, call for something to be on the agenda, it will get put on the agenda. And that the role of the vice mayor in these conversations is as an advisor, not a decider.
So what if Jim, think through that scenario. So if we had a guidance that had authorized either the city manager or the mayor to agendize items within the context that the mayor is supposed to reflect the council as a whole, would that be problematic? Can you think of situations?
I think that application, and the city attorney needs to help me, I think actually runs afoul of the charter. I mean, in this sense, once again, the mayor can't put things directly on as a single member in other situations. So to be in this meeting to do it, I mean, the way it really works in practice is the mayor tries to influence the manager to put it on the agenda, which is fine.
And so that goes back to my earlier question of, what happens in that situation? So then, altering my original suggestion, perhaps it is the city manager decides, the mayor guides, and the vice mayor offers additional advice.
Yeah, and I want to, have us recall that within our own procedures, any one council member? Two council members can, through either comments or through a colleague's memo, can get things agendized. So if the mayor, in that rare circumstance, and I can tell you that, these things get worked out if there's an issue, and at least this city manager works to respect and accommodate the interests of the council, reflected through the mayor. I'm not sure it's always been the case, but we don't currently have that as an issue. So go ahead, Tom.
Just wonder if we could clarify a little bit what we're saying about the vice mayor. I mean, we're not having a vote or anything. They're not really like a tiebreaker. Are they there? Are we saying they're just there to fill in when the mayor can't be there? Or this idea of giving additional advice?
That's what the charter says that the vice mayor's role is. And I think really the reason that the vice mayor is at pre-council is it's kind of a training scenario. Really.
Okay.
They're watching that process unfold so that they're ready to hit the ground running in the event the customary rule is followed and they become
So we had a
mayor.
situation where the vice mayor's been dominating the meetings?
No, never since I've been here. I mean, regardless of the different personalities of folks, the folks in the vice mayor role really defer to the mayor, and I think it is very much in that mode.
It also allows the mayor to ask the vice mayor to assist with difficult public comment. Will you count the minutes or these kinds of tasks? That gets worked out in pre-council.
But the problem is that 3.7 doesn't reflect that.
Right.
Yeah.
I can't tell you, I don't think I've ever seen a situation where there was an overt disagreement between the mayor and the vice mayor in one of these meetings. You know what I mean? Just not there.
Everyone is clear about.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me ask, we had three possible issues here. One was, do we want to change any wording that further clarifies the relationship between the mayor and the city manager? And we kind of heard how the dynamic really works, and I'm not sure that I feel a need to have wording changes in that regard. But if you guys feel differently, I'm open. Corey?
Yeah, I'm very pleased to hear that it has not been an issue in the last couple of years, but just to...
I'm not saying the whole time I've been here, I'm not saying anything. That's just only the span of my experience.
Right. And so, still...
One dog year.
One of...
One dog year.
Right. So, one of the purposes of having this document is also, public facing. It's education for new council members as well. When new council members come on to join the body, to have a clear written document that helps them to understand the roles of their colleagues, and also plays that important role for the public. And even if we're not fixing a problem, if we're just clarifying, that's all this item on our agenda, calls for.
So do you have language?
Well, so. Yes, something along the lines of what I was suggesting before. So this is something where I'd ask I don't want to give the exact language right now, but I'd put it among the items. I would like to see this as one of the items that staff suggests language to identify the roles of these three individuals during agenda setting. It can be very simple, that the city manager, something along the lines of, the city manager makes the decisions, relying on or with the advice and guidance of the mayor and additional input from the vice mayor, with all three, as Councilmember Burt suggested, considering the needs of the city and the council as a whole.
Okay, so let's break them up between three parts. So language along the lines of what Corey described that reflects the respective roles of the city manager and the mayor in the agenda setting.
And the vice mayor.
Well, just a second. Second one is clarification on the limited role of the vice mayor in this process. And then the third one is to clarify the role of the mayor in relation to the council, which is that the mayor's reflecting the interest, attempting to reflect the interest of the council as a whole. Are those seen? Okay.
That's fine.
Is everybody okay with that guidance? Yep. Onward.
I just want to do a quick check as we move on to the next item. That's a big one, and I think a really important one, but I am going to leave it at 10.
Okay, we'll miss you.
So
We may be over by then, but if we aren't, we'll miss you.
That's fine. That's fine. I'm just letting folks know.
Okay. I wouldn't mind leaving by 10 either, so maybe we'll just cut it off.
We staff reports got tomorrow, and we still have a couple meaty ones
Okay.
that have to be done early in the morning.
So, all right, well, let's just wade into this and then see how far we get. First, 2A is in the event a council member intends a motion other than the staff recommendation, it's this about providing the motion to the clerk via digital means. We've been starting to practice this, but I also don't want this to be prescriptive. And so I recommend language that it's encouraged to the extent feasible, because, I mean, this also, to some degree, presumes that the council member had figured out the motion in advance. maybe in advance of the meeting or early in the meeting or whatever, and that's not necessarily the case. So I think it has helped us, but I don't want to have this be prescriptive. You guys agree with that?
Yeah,
Tom?
yes, I mean, obviously, if we were to change technology and go totally digital in terms of paper, we could perhaps even think of faster ways to do it. I think part of the issue right now is it gets hung up in email sometimes if you're doing it on the fly. But
Yeah, but I will say that there are also different styles. I mean, some people aren't comfortable with verbalizing their thoughts well, and they're very comfortable with writing them out, and others are the opposite. So one of the things we've always wanted to do is respect different manners and styles among 9 council members.
If I just might add, I mean, I think at some point, this is more at the high level, the mechanics of how this is done are worthy of being spoken to, particularly the interface with the clerk. But the other issue, it's one of the reasons that you have dumb terminals there on the dais, is to sort of manage the concern and even the public perception about communication between council members that is not part of the public piece. And I would just say, probably if you simultaneously did have council members up here typing stuff and stuff is going up, people could certainly start to say, well, wait, are you guys talking to each other and working this out private? So it's just one of those concerns that's always been there as it relates to the Brown Act and those sorts of things.
let's
Don't want to preclude it, but.
No, but why don't we take that on? So we don't have it, I don't think we have clarity in our policies that say there shall be no electronic or other, you know what, occasionally somebody passes a note. And those notes shouldn't be about policy issues. They may be about process in the middle of a meeting of, gee, should we move this thing forward? But we don't have that down here, and I think that's something that we should. I know a lot of cities do have policy on it more clearer than we do.
Many cities do. So just to be clear, it is not illegal to have communications that do address the item in a substantive way and address policy, except if the conferring creates a Brown Act violation within the meeting itself. So assuming that doesn't happen, it is lawful to confer even between council members, between staff, with lobbyists, with members of the public. In many, many communities, people feel that during an active meeting, that's really fundamentally inappropriate. And so many councils have adopted rules that simply ban the practice.
Okay, so we have the discretion to go beyond what is legally required, and it's not one of the items we had down here. I think it's an appropriate one that in part came up because we were considering this other item. I think that's, especially as we're, evolving toward more and more electronics use, and council members don't put away all their electronic computers or otherwise. I mean, we're looking at our packets online as well. So I think it's, we're not going to be able to get around this notion of, gee, if somebody's on a keyboard, the public is going to be concerned that they're talking to a colleague in a non-transparent way. Molly just clarified that's legal as long as it's limited. But do we want to have guidelines that say we're not going to communicate electronically amongst ourselves during a meeting?
So can I say that, I mean, let's add that as something to have a discussion about. I think it's definitely worth having a discussion about.
Okay, so we'll fold that into our follow-up meeting. Is that your suggestion?
Or
Court?
yeah.
Yeah, and just my quick thoughts about that, my understanding, and I could be wrong about this, my understanding is that if council members are utilizing electronic devices during a meeting, that is potentially subject to public records requests.
So you're thinking of the San Jose case, that's before the California Supreme Court, so we're going to get a ruling from the High Court on that.
So it's undecided.
We had two different rulings that with the Superior Court saying those are public records on privately held devices, the Court of Appeal disagreeing and saying those were not public records, so the California Supreme Court has taken that issue up. That issue is broader than just conduct that occurs during a council meeting, but the case did arise from council members communicating not amongst themselves, but with members of the public and applicants, lobbyists, et cetera, who were in the audience or elsewhere on the substantive item during the meeting.
I was just gonna, I'm not trying to be rude, but let's get back to what we have on the agenda, and let's have a broader conversation on this entire topic at a later date.
If that was the plan, sorry, to come back with that one later.
Yeah,
time.
that's what
Okay.
we said.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. So we had the guidance on the 2A being a encouragement. 2B is this issue we've had about whether staff reports should offer options even while they may have a staff recommendation. And so this has been, this is probably a bigger policy question than some of the others are a little more procedural, but this is a policy question. And it's something that's come up a number of times. You know, probably one of the, related to this is the issue, and I think maybe Jim, you can address this, whether we've corrected this or changed it, which is even if there is a recommendation and we, for instance, look at comp plan consistency, do we also the staff share comp plan inconsistencies? So any thoughts from you on this issue, on either of those two aspects? Alternatives being presented in staff reports, and on occasion we're seeing that now, and then about how a project's comp plan compliance is presented.
Chair Burt, yeah, if I could just jump in we possibly need to draw a distinction between legislative matters, where certainly you could make whatever rule you want in terms of how you want to see a single recommendation or recommendation with options. The rule may be different on land use items where our code requires at a staff level that a decision has been made and it's subject to appeal. So in that case, the staff is directed by our law to apply our existing laws to a particular application, and they are reporting to you that they've done that, how they've done that, and then it's been appealed. So that is a really different situation. There have been cases where council members have, in doing your legitimate role of reweighing those, have said, well, we're not comfortable in various ways, you know, and have asked for some assistance in understanding the range of parameters of decision you could make. But and that I think has worked fine. It's a different matter to think about asking that to be prepared in advance. And I think we have to have a longer conversation if that's what the council is
interested in. Can I ask a question on that, though? So if there's a decision that's been appealed and it's been voted to be heard as an appeal, at that point, could staff offer options?
So the answer is yes. Your staff can assist you in the ways that you need, but whether we sometimes will do that through confidential legal advice as opposed to prescribing that staff reports be written in a certain way, I think this is a sensitive area that requires some careful thought.
And Jim, did you have comments
Yes.
on? Yeah.
Well, I think that we have made some progress. I don't think that we're there yet, and this is a complicated area. A couple of things. I think, and the chair stated this, that we clearly want to recognize that the staff has a professional responsibility to make recommendations for the most part in reports, and since technically even ultimately all of them come from the city manager, actually the charter even anticipates that the city manager has the the right and the responsibility to participate in council discussions, but not to vote. So there's nothing wrong with having a recommendation. I think the problem has been that there is discretion in interpretation that the staff applies in some areas more than others. I mean, some of them are more bound to have a range of discretion. To the extent that the staff has built up a rationale for just that conclusion, that sort of sometimes leaves a bad taste in people's mouth a little bit, saying, well, wait a minute, what about the alternative? Particularly, as you're saying, the comp plan also says, you know, whatever it is, we'll have these qualities, and you haven't identified those, so wouldn't there be another conclusion? So I think that, I don't exactly know how we word it. I think it's a longer discussion. I think clearly in the body of the work, we need to be sensitive to the fact that there could be conflicts and that we adequately represent those conflicts and come down on it with a recommendation. I think it gets harder when we really start to try to talk about crafting alternative motions. I've worked in some other jurisdictions where that really, I'd say, backfired, because you'd have a recommendation that the staff had, and then for the most part, you'd have this completely nullifying alternative that just sounded, you know, well, of course we can say no rather than yes, but I wanted something that had these justifications more. And then that gets into a lot of, that asks the staff to really put themselves in the mind or the perspective of other people in a way as to how they would express it. So I really do think that we want to, as you look at this, do we need to have more language that does clarify that the staff will do its best in certain areas to identify the range of, you know, issues and present them in such a way that not just a council member, but say a member of the public could get the broad picture, and the staff would be more explicit about connecting why they're making a recommendation. You know what I mean? It's almost like in research when you say, you should state your bias. Then we know what it is and how you're interpreting it. But acknowledge and leave room for the fact that there's this alternative perspective. And I think a lot of it also has to do with the way we write it, that almost makes it sound like, well, this is obviously the only conclusion that could be drawn from it. And that's the problem. That's nuance.
If we get this somewhere codified, it's also transparent to the public as to this is how it will be presented. You're not doing something contrary to the agreement on how you would function. But I have a question, where does that go? I mean, it's not our procedures. We could say that we expect to receive staff reports in such a way, but I don't know that that's really an appropriate place to put it. So, Molly, I don't know if you have any thoughts on if Jim came back with proposed language for our consideration that would reflect what he just described, which is a starting point of what is current thinking of kind of the rough parameters on how staff does staff reports and how they treat these issues that we were just discussing. Is there an appropriate place in our own policies and procedures to put that? And if not, where would it be parked?
Maybe Jim and I can think about that a little bit, but there are a set of policies and procedures that are issued at the manager level. And maybe that would be a good place to describe in a very general way.
Yeah, and maybe our policies and procedures under agenda items or something would simply refer to some of that. In fact, that's an important, I've read those a long time ago, but we don't read those much, and they're not referenced, so we don't think to look at them. And so maybe...
We do.
Yeah, so maybe you don't want us to read them, I don't know, but maybe that's another question is, are there appropriate places to just reference them in this?
Actually.
Yeah, Corey?
Yeah, page 34 might be the right place to do that. Item 2.5, staff conduct with city council. Not sure it's the best place, but it's a potential. And especially if it's maybe referencing other documents or other work to be crafted, or but doing it at a very high level, that might be an appropriate place to talk about things like, being comfortable with ambiguity.
So this is about conduct, and we'd either want to add a section or change the title, I would think. Yeah, it's not practices, it's conduct. Like, don't cuss us out, and we won't cuss you out, you know?
You know what, fair enough. Okay, so scratch that. So maybe 2.4 is not the right place for it.
Can I ask a quick question? Sorry, but where did it initially say that packets would come out 5 days ahead in advance, and then we changed that to 10? And was that, I don't even know where that was written. I don't even remember what the official document exists. If
Yeah,
it does.
I don't know if we actually have this in the procedures and protocols, but certainly we haven't amended them to reflect the new time frame. So,
Our procedures or yours, you mean?
on the council's procedures and
I don't think it's
protocols.
ours, yeah.
So maybe that's the kind of thing as we look to draft a new version of this with updates of new jurisprudence and new technology, just to update it to include the changes that we've made over the last couple of years since this last had a really thorough review.
Well, so that's right. So this is part of what I was saying, we also kind of need this line-by-line discussion, which are things that are either outdated or omissions or ambiguities in our, aside from these ones that we have in attachment A.
So Pat?
Yeah.
So I'd like to say I'm really interested in this item as a discussion. I think we should carry it over and try to focus on some of the meeting management.
Yeah, and so whether it's able to be on the follow-up meeting here, whether you might be able to draft some, both language, Jim, and that would be in your procedures, and how we would reference them in ours, since they matter a lot to us, and what we receive. Okay. So now we're on to 2C. So this is about something that, when I looked at it, I'm not sure that this, for the most part, needs to be in our protocols. There could be some guidance to mayors on how to conduct meetings along reflecting this. I think it's just good practice. And this kind of goes in the category that hardly anybody would disagree with, but it's useful to have it there as reminders. I mean, when council members come on the council, if this whole set of documents is a real good guide for a bunch of answers on how to do stuff and how stuff will be done. And that's the same thing for the mayor. I can tell you, when the mayor comes on, they have to read this thing 3 times and highlight it and tab it, because there's a lot of things that the mayor has to remember to follow. It's easy for us to catch the things the mayor doesn't follow, but it's harder for the mayor to remember all the things to follow. So just adding guidance, I think, is helpful. If everybody kind of, if some of these things are kind of, well, that's common sense, but it's not there, then it's simply helpful to have the common sense written down in a non-prescriptive way, in my mind.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I read this, I thought it's common sense, doesn't need to be in there. It's just paying attention to the length of this document. You don't want to throw everything in there, right?
Yeah, and so I think it's if we can put it concisely under how the mayor runs the meeting, it's probably a helpful thing. Yeah. Anybody disagree with it?
Yeah, well, there's one item in particular that I do think is worth highlighting, which is making best effort to inform the public that their item will not be heard if there's changes in the agenda, or if it looks like we're going to have to continue an item because we're running out of time. I think that that's really useful and important out of respect for the public who has come to speak on a comment, or to comment on
I mean,
an item.
for instance, I agree with that, and I don't think there's not much value in saying make every effort to keep us on schedule in the procedures. And then the second one is commit to hearing the public who have come to an item in a time frame that the item was noticed.
It just basically says, that's basically saying keep on schedule.
Well, so I actually thought it was more nuanced than that. So we say from 8 to 9, we're going to have this item. That's not actually part of our formal public notice, but it's an informal notice to the public. They come here and they think they're going to be able to talk in a given time frame.
We did draft some language that's at the top of every agenda that informs the public that those are just guidelines.
Right. So-
They're set, early on before the public
And
dialogue
this
is fully.
doesn't say thou shalt.
Right.
Public notice is not the right way we would want to have. If we adopted something like this, we'd want to say it's, make an effort to allow the public to speak within the time frame that's in the guidelines that we've,
Or just
but-
inform the public of the progress of the night's agenda and whether items are anticipated to be removed or continued.
yeah.
I mean, and I guess, the language here that makes me uncomfortable is commit to hearing. Is make every effort to keep us on schedule, commit to hearing, and I'd remove the commit to. Because you're not. You're making every effort, but you're not guaranteeing that.
Right.
That's necessarily going to happen.
I mean, the way I read this was you'd commit to hearing the public even if we don't discuss the item till much later.
That's what I was, so that's a distinction that I was going to make to Corey, is that I read this to be speaking not on when we would complete the item, but when we would allow the public to speak. But I also agree with Mark that we should soften that language. So it's not an obligation, it's simply an effort and a reminder that we're going to try to do that.
Because it could get really weird. I mean, I'm just trying to think, in practice, if you pause out one thing.
Yep.
The council has contemplated that a couple times, and you've declined to do it because it is disruptive. It creates inefficiencies.
So if we change commit to make efforts to hear the public who have come to speak to an item in the time frame that the item was, it's not noticed. Molly, you described how what was that?
Yeah, I'm happy to play with the language, Chair Byrd.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
All right, good. So you got the sense, great.
Pat, if I-
Yeah,
So I heard this from another city council member, in another city, that I don't know if we would want to actually write it down, but what they do is they, during public comment, and somebody from the public makes a point, the mayor pulls the audience, says how many people agree with that point. Everybody raises their hands, and they're like, great, if additional speakers, if you have a new point, make your new point, but we've heard that point.
okay, so that's kind of something related that is over on the next page on what you had, it's under J, I think, right? J2. Yeah,
Yeah, that's it, exactly.
so it's related, and several things on this next page actually fold into this.
And it's, again, I think it's more the style of the mayor. If they want to do that, they can do that. I don't know if you have to put it in your policies.
Right, right. Yeah, I think it's an interesting thing to try and see if it helps expedite things on a voluntary basis.
Has to be done softly, you're not preventing anybody
Right.
from speaking.
Yeah, because where you had it down in,
J2,
was it that,
public comment.
and then ask that only new points be made.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Again, it has to be
I
done
would say
softly and-
encourage rather than ask,
Right.
or suggest, or something like that. But either way, I'm thinking not to put it in procedures, but that,
But I guess
Be
this is where our
interested in seeing it
meetings.
tried.
Right, this is where our meetings can get off. If we have a lot of public speakers.
Right.
If we had a way maybe to manage that in a
Yep.
publicly friendly way.
yeah. So if that works, I think that would be worth having the mayor try that and see how that works. It might be an effective practice. And in no way discourage the public from their right to speak if they so choose. Okay, let's see. Next one is setting a hard ending time.
I just flat out disagree with this one.
Yeah. But I will say that we have rules on taking up a new item, and some bodies have even tighter rules of making it a more deliberate action if we are going to continue past a given time. And why don't we look at those and see whether we want to have our action be more deliberate, although here's the trade-off, which is, do we create a whole new debate on whether we continue debating?
We've done it before.
So when we look at it, let's be conscious of that and try and strike a balance.
I mean, I think we already say we won't take up a new item after 10:30, right?
Right. And the question is, does that work well enough, and do we want something else added to that? Molly?
I don't think the rule is a ban on taking things up. I think it's just discourage or something like that.
So why don't we think about that for the next meeting on whether is there any way to tighten it up some without being rigid? Corey?
Yeah, and just to reiterate that point, again, I do agree we should bring it up at the next meeting, but yeah, something like items coming up after 10:30 or the meeting extending past 11 or 11:30, at that point, we would take a vote on whether to continue or whether to push it, just like we now take a vote on whether to go to closed session.
So, given that it is now 9:48, and we should be thinking about, I did want to save, hopefully, maybe 10 minutes to be able to look at our draft meeting schedule. So what do you guys think about cutting off our discussion of these things at this point in time, and then moving to upcoming agendas?
I'm fine with that.
Great.
If we were close to the end, I'd say let's push through, but
Yeah. All right. And Cash and I had a discussion on, well, something else wasn't ready for this meeting, and I said, I think this topic could use at least one meeting, so it's, but, we're taking on some stuff. At first, the council did, kind of took on some policies and procedure discussions more deeply than we often have at our retreats and our committee as a whole. And then we're kind of wading into this stuff, and I think it ultimately is going to be valuable, but it takes some work. Okay, before us we have this draft schedule, and Cash has laid out a series of different topics. So let's look at two things. Well, maybe three. The priority and the sequence, and we may have something that's a higher priority, but it's not going to be ripe, and so it won't necessarily be the highest sequence. Whether we've got too much scheduled for a given night, and if so, if we start seeing that pattern, whether we're going to want to have any months where we have 3 meetings. Now, we have had some where we only had 1 so far, right? In fact, that's all we've had so far this year, yeah. So if we just look at, for instance, the next meeting, the auditor's quarterly report is generally, goes pretty quickly. The work plan could be a fairly deep discussion before we destroy it. And we might have a lot of the public here on the minimum wage, and there are actually a lot of aspects to it that will require discussion. So those are 2 pretty big items for the 28th. If we look at the only other evening that we have an agenda, those are actually a little quicker. Other than the smoking, I don't anticipate a whole bunch of discourse or big public and probably not a big part of public participation on the smoking, even though we might have some issues. We might. I mean, this could be something where people get real concerned and do end up engaging. So just looking at those two meetings, one is, are those the things we want to, among the real substantive items, are those the ones we want to have in those two meetings? Or is there anything else that we think is more urgent, and then we have to ask staff whether, if we thought it was more urgent, could it be moved forward? More urgent or more important?
Well, when would we follow up on this current discussion?
Sorry?
When would we finish the protocols and procedures?
Oh, yeah. So,
Start to finish.
so Cash, now that we are having to roll over a pretty substantial discussion on procedures and protocols, how does that fit with what we have in agendas? Are any of these how urgent is the smoking ordinance?
I mean, it's not urgent, but I mean, we're on a track to get it done, and the staff report's almost done, and
Well, that's our issue on the staff side of it, but I think as far as from a policy perspective and getting it enacted, I don't mean to say that it's urgent in the sense of balancing the work that you have. We're just now rolling out the first part of the ban itself, and we'll be working through some enforcement issues on just the regular smoking part in public, that actually in some ways might be informative. So, I mean, I'd rather see the council continue to make progress on these items that have been referred to you as far as protocols and issues more than getting the smoking.
Okay, and we also have this list of things that are going to the committee as a whole, out of which a number of these may be referred to the Policy and Services Committee. And then we have colleagues' memos, and I didn't really see those down here reflected in the policy, this draft agenda. So
I don't have a list of all the colleagues' memos coming down. The only colleagues' memo that was on the agenda but then got pulled was the one about the neighborhoods.
They hadn't gone to
It hasn't
council
gone to council yet.
So I know there's one that Mayor Holman's working on ARB and guidance on the role and other elements to any changes to our how the ARB functions and guidance on some certain issues. But what about colleagues' memos that have already come before the council?
Well, these are the only ones
We've got
that I know of, but we'll look
minimum
back with
wage.
the clerk and really look at. Yeah, minimum wage was one.
Yep. But are there others? I'm trying to recall whether
I mean, the
there's,
smoking ordinance had originally been a colleague's memo.
Yeah.
okay.
Can I offer a suggestion?
Yeah.
If there's concern about having all three of these items on 428, what if we did the citywide minimum, and I'm just throwing out ideas, but the minimum wage ordinance and the city's legislative program, which I think wouldn't be too controversial or take too long, on 428, and then all of the auditor's stuff
On the 12th,
on the 12th.
that's better.
And I'm assuming we're going to have a second meeting in May, at which time we could do the smoking ordinance. We could start with the smoking ordinance and then roll into the policies and protocol stuff also, to see how much we can get done, depending on.
Yeah, I think we ought to keep momentum on this stuff. There's a lot here, and this was a number of the things, including things that will yet get referred to us probably by the committee as a whole. Any idea on when that next committee as a whole meeting would be?
Beth,
No?
Mayor's been,
Not yet. We've been looking for dates for other council meetings, but we haven't looked for committee of the whole
Okay.
yet.
Well, then part of this question ties into whether we, wanting to look at the, when we might have a supplemental Policy and Services Committee meeting. So maybe, do people have their calendars handy, and can we see if we can have a discussion around that? We would have the option of doing it we have the 28th down. Next week would clearly be too soon, but we could have it 2 successive weeks in late April, like the, the 20, so the 28th is a Tuesday, and we've been meeting regularly on the Wednesdays, right?
No, we normally,
You've been meeting Tuesdays.
Tuesday, okay.
we changed this one because of one of us.
Gotcha, all right.
April
that's right,
21st,
the
Tuesday,
Buena
April 21st is the Tall Tree Award.
Okay.
Right.
All right, that doesn't work. So then in May, we could either have one before or after the 12th, meeting on the 12th. We could have the 5th, the 19th, or the 26th, if we were to have a supplemental one, or any of those.
I'm sorry, could you repeat those dates?
The 5th, the 19th, or the 26th of May.
If I might weigh in, the Finance Committee is scheduled through May, and the budget is really intensive up until that, the next to last week through the 22nd. So the week of, say, Monday the 25th, Finance is supposed to roughly be done with their work. It would be certainly better for the staff if you were to be able to do the 26th of May, just because we're having 2 or 3 meetings a week with Finance during 3 weeks there in May.
I can do the 26th.
You're saying the 26th, okay, let's see.
If that's possible.
So we do have a council meeting that Wednesday, so we'd be here, right, 25th, 26th, 27th.
What's on the 27th? I'm not seeing it on my
Count that. Beth just sent it out.
That was,
It's not on our calendar.
so Beth, that was one of the ones you polled on, right? So we haven't
Correct.
heard confirmation yet?
I did send out an email the other day to save Wednesday, the 27th for a council meeting, May 27th, and then May 6th.
Yeah, so that one wasn't at.
May 6th?
Wednesday, the 27th, so those are confirmed, you're saying?
Those 4.
Correct.
Wait, which were those? Because they're not listed on our events calendar.
Let me pull up the email, but the email I just sent, I
6th.
believe it was yesterday, is the 6th of May and the 29th of May,
Wait, 27th?
or 27th of May.
Okay.
So,
That the meeting on the 6th is going to pan out, given the subject matter that we wanted to put on as far as staff availability. City
Yeah, we're looking
attorney
at doing
is,
study sessions,
pardon me,
board and commission study sessions
for the 6th of May?
for the 6th.
Okay, thanks.
And the 27th is tentatively down, huh?
So I could do the 26th or the 19th.
I could too.
Okay. Let's plan for that.
Can I ask a question about other agenda items?
Wait, Corey, are you the 26th?
Are you talking about the 26th and the 19th, or 26th or the 19th?
We're talking about the 26th instead of,
That's fine.
Yeah.
okay. Somebody else was?
Tom.
Yeah,
Tom?
just, so is there anything with RPP that would come to us, or that's all rolling along?
I don't think there's anything that's, I don't think so, not in this first phase.
And then aircraft noise stuff, would that come back to us either? or-
Well, air traffic may come back to you, you know,
It was referred to the council from this committee.
Okay.
Last time was the action.
I mean, I think if we were maybe going sideways, we'd think about it. But, you know, if we're on track with proceeding with the, you know, the historical data study and analysis and able to do that, and that's under the threshold, we can proceed with that. So it would be more like going to the council, I think, for affirmation.
Okay, so,
Can I ask?
Yeah.
So going back to your point about the momentum that we've got on this, which I agree with, I guess my overarching question is, you know, we've got good momentum. I'm skeptical that we're going to get through all of these items and do a line by line in one meeting.
I think you're right.
And what, just in terms of overall timing and the implementation of some of this stuff, what's the idea there?
Well, if you kind of look at the changes that we tentatively adopted tonight, were any of them urgent? And I don't think so. They were all good changes, but I didn't see an urgency. I certainly think the council as a whole was not looking for this to come back to them in the fall. So I think we want to keep pushing this. And I agree with you that I don't think we've got just one meeting, especially if other things are on the agenda. So one of the things that we could do, since, you know, if we scheduled something tentatively for a fraction of one of the upcoming meetings, and we ended up deciding to roll it over, it wouldn't kill anything.
Yeah.
So maybe that's what we ought to be doing. If we think that, but the 28th, but if we have both the work plan and the minimum wage, that's a pretty full meeting. So the earliest that we could try and put something on would be on the 12th. Mm-hmm. And so if it's okay with you guys, why don't we add this to the tentative agenda, the agenda for the 12th, with an understanding that if we can't get to it, we'll push it out.
The 26th or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
Great. And on that note, oh, you were supposed to have left 5 minutes ago. Okay. Anything else? Anybody have anything? Yeah.
We're going to keep the order. We're going to do the auditor's quarterly report on the 28th, the work plan, and the minimum wage.
Yeah.
And then the same 3 items for the, okay.
Good. And I'd like to say goodnight to the audience.
Well, actually, sorry, real quick, that was, the concern there was that the work plan and the minimum wage are both big items, and doing them the same night might be problematic. I think that was Mark's point earlier, and I agreed.
Well, that was Pat's point earlier.
Or Pat.
Yeah,
I just think that's going to be a very, very tough evening. I don't mind staying late, but let's all plan
Well,
to not
let me
have
just
morning
say,
meetings
on the
next day.
work plan, in some past years, that has been a multiple meeting. So we may not be able to complete the work plan. It may start the discussion, and we may schedule completion on a subsequent date.
Okay.
Okay. All right, meeting's adjourned.
All right.